Are we live? Ayun, there we are. Hi chat, good morning. Good morning chat. Tayo magbe-build. Di pa ako inaantok. Well, I woke up like, oras pa ako nagising. 12:30? I've been up for 4 hours. So, build tayo. Ay, mali yung title. Di ko na update. So, 30. Early. Hindi ko pa na-update yung title, chat. Episode 30 na tayo ng pag-build. Imagine. We've gone a long way. But, here's the build. I don't want my dim light. Ayan. Mighty strike. So, clear tayo ng backlogs natin. Goal is, completely maubos ang backlogs. So, 4 bags. Plus the manual. Some stickers. I think I'd prefer the direct light. Okay. Let's open the bags. Stickers. Ito lang naman may stickers niya. Never mind. May iba pala. Beam saber effect. I got BMs. Ay. Ayun. Some minor parts. Oh, it's a black blade. The color correction stickers. For the wings. Yep, for the wings. What if we build the wings first? Iba natin build order. Nah, let's build the chest, then the wings. Okay. Iba natin build order. Para lang may variety naman kahit paano. Si Jules. Okay. Just for the tools. Oy, parang gusto kong makinig ng chat ng podcast. Mr. Ballin. Medical mysteries. Episode 27 minutes.
Hey Prime members, you can binge episodes 65 through 72 right now and ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the app today. A quick note about our stories. They are all inspired by true events, but we do sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and also some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In the spring of 1986, an investigator parked his car in front of a small home in upstate New York, where a deadly fire had broken out and killed his friend. The fire had long been extinguished, but the investigator was there now to try to figure out what had caused it. When the investigator entered the house, his eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe how extensive the damage was. When he made his way into the bedroom, where the fire had apparently started, and where his friend had died, what he saw there sent a chill down his spine and confirmed that this was no ordinary fire.
Start reading.
They say Hollywood is where dreams are made. A seductive city where men flock to get rich,
Start with the body.
and capture America's heart.
Siyempre may
When the
ads.
spotlight turns off, fame,
Sila na libre sa
fortune,
mundo
and
ngayon.
lives can disappear in an instant. Follow Hollywood and Crime, the Cotton Club Murder on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
In the depths of an Atlanta forest, the clash between activists and authorities ends in tragedy. I'm Matthew Scher, and on my new podcast, We Came to the Forest, we expose the hidden truths behind a shootout that left one activist dead and countless lives forever changed. Binge all episodes of We Came to the Forest ad-free on Wondery Plus.
From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Even though we rarely think about it, it is truly a miracle how well our bodies work, basically all of the time, and without any real effort from us. But sometimes, our perfect-seeming systems do break down, and when that happens, we turn to modern medicine to both diagnose our issue and fix it for us. However, there are very rare cases of people's bodies breaking down where their symptoms are so bizarre, so mysterious, so dumbfounding that no one, including the best medical experts out there, can figure out what is wrong or how to go about treating them. And on this show, these rare medical cases will be our focus. Every week, we'll explore a new baffling medical mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please invite the follow button to go to a movie with you and offer to bring the snacks. But only pack room temperature Filet-O-Fish sandwiches.
Tapos C5
This
and
week's story
D12.
is called Ashes to Ashes.
D12. C5.
Kendall Mott kept his eyes locked on the road as he drove towards the home of his father, 58-year-old George Mott. It was 6 p.m. on March 26, 1986, and the sun was hanging low in the sky over Crown Point, which is a small country town in upstate New York. A few hours earlier, 32-year-old Kendall had received a phone call from his sister Kimberly. She had called their dad multiple times over the course of that day, but all she kept getting was his answering machine, so Kimberly was worried. Part of that worry came from the fact that their dad lived alone since he had divorced their mom a few years back. On top of that, his health was declining. George was an ex-smoker, and now he had some serious issues with his lungs. He used an oxygen mask, and he'd just recovered from a bout of pneumonia that had sent him to the hospital for a few days. Kimberly was afraid their dad might have fallen or passed out, or maybe even something worse. She knew it would be somewhat convenient for Kendall to stop by their dad's place on his way home from work, so she called him and begged him to go by and make sure their dad was okay. And of course, Kendall had said yes. But as Kendall drove through the woods down a lonely two-lane road, he really wasn't too worried. He had visited with their dad at his house 2 days earlier. George was taking his medications and was in good spirits considering all the issues he'd been dealing with. Kendall was sure there was a reasonable explanation for why George wasn't answering his phone. Maybe George's friends picked him up and took him to a local diner called the Wagon Wheel, where Kendall knew they liked to hang out. If that was the case, then Kendall knew he wouldn't be gone for very long, and so Kendall planned to just wait inside the house until his dad came home, and then once he was back and he knew he was okay, Kendall would call Kimberly and everything would be fine. And regardless of if there was a problem or not with his dad, Kendall was happy to pop by because he was close with his dad. His dad used to be a firefighter, and he was very devoted to his profession. He spent long hours at the station away from the family, but since his retirement a few years ago, he was much more present in the lives of Kendall, yes, and their children. And that really made Kendall happy.
Matagal na ako nakikinig kay nanonood kay Mr. Ballin.
A few minutes later,
Also, good
Kendall
morning.
pulled
You're
off
up
the main
early.
road and began making his way down a long driveway that
Di ka
wound
makatulog?
between tall maple trees. George lived in a tiny one-bedroom house in a sparsely populated area about 4 miles west of town. It was very peaceful and quiet and green out there. The nearest neighbor lived about a half mile away.
But yes, okay.
At the end of the driveway,
Okay,
Kendall parked his
anyari?
car a
Where you
few feet
play?
away
Have
from
you
his
been
dad's
playing?
house. He hopped out and then walked up to the front door. But as he got closer, he
Yung
noticed
coffee
that
late,
the
need to make it.
windows near the front door looked a little bit different.
Well.
They had a dark tint to them, kind of like the windows
Yun
of a
lang.
magazine. Kendall thought that was
Wala
very
tayong laban
strange. He
dyan.
figured he would investigate once he got inside. And so Kendall got up to the front door and he knocked,
Great.
but his dad didn't come to the door. So Kendall reached down and tried the doorknob, and right away he felt two things. One, he felt the doorknob was already unlocked. 2, most importantly, he noticed the doorknob was hot to the touch. And immediately, a bolt of fear shot.
Just watching videos and started playing a few minutes ago. Practicing jungle. Ay gago, sayang. Laro na lang sana tayo, hindi na ako nag-build.
And so Kendall immediately whipped open the door and looked inside, but there was no fire. In fact, the house was totally quiet and nearly pitch black. Kendall instinctively reached over and flipped the light switch, but the lights didn't turn on.
Oo nga, Jules, good morning. Ikaw din, maaga ka din.
Thick, dark haze
Good morning din sa'yo.
It was impossible to see through. It smelled a little like smoke.
I thought you were doing builds. I mean,
much more unsettling.
Yeah, I guess. I had nothing better to do. Kaya, build na lang ako. Could have played na lang sana.
Kendall knew it had to be bad.
Na. Magbibuild na lang ako. Magbibuild na lang ako. Nasimulan ko na din yung stream eh.
Could not be good for him. So Kendall stepped into the front
living room
and yelled out for his dad, but there was no reply.
Thank you though.
Kendall felt
so sabi, seryoso ba? Di ka pa natutulog, Jules?
Towards the back of the house, to the bedroom where his dad slept.
Bakit?
Got there, again, he just couldn't.
Di ba yun uso sa'yo? Ayaw nga, vampira ka nga pala, no? Manananggal pala, manananggal, sorry. I stand corrected. Manananggal.
So Kendall turned, sprinted outside, got into his car, and sped over to the house next door to see if the neighbor had a flashlight.
Wait, what? Was that not it?
Luckily, the neighbor was home, and they did have a flashlight. And so after explaining what was going on, the two of them raced back over to George's house.
Ay, oo nga pala.
But when Kendall arrived back at his dad's front door, he stopped.
B1.
He was holding out hope that his dad was not home and that he was safe,
it's
and that
18 and 19.
inside
I'm
of his
stupid.
house had nothing to do with his dad. But Kendall also realized that now that they had this flashlight, when the neighbor went in there and shined it around, he might reveal something totally horrible to Kendall. And suddenly, Kendall standing there right in front of the door, he just felt like he couldn't handle that. He couldn't go in and see whatever happened to his dad.
Oo nga. Okay.
So,
may supply lang. Kala ko, nagtitinda sila eh.
Pulled the collar of his t-shirt up over his
Shadow
mouth
on
and stepped into the house. The next few minutes were agonizing for Kendall as he waited to hear what was hidden beneath the black haze inside his father's home. Finally, the neighbor emerged from the house, and from the grim expression on the man's face, Kendall could tell something horrible had happened. Within the next hour, the house was filled with inspectors from the local police and fire departments, and all of them were deeply confused by the scene laid out before them. It didn't take them long to determine that a fire had broken out inside of George's house. But the way the fire behaved just didn't make sense.
Excited nga rin ako, kaso tinulugan ba naman ako? Sino? Ay, yung friend mo.
And into the living room,
actually, gusto mo ba tumambay?
Covering everything. But nothing in the room was actually burnt. It was clear.
Do you wanna tambay on
inside of that house?
Somewhere?
Sitting on a table in the middle of the room were 3 pill bottles that had all melted together into one plastic clump. There was also a nail hammered into the wall, and hanging from it was the metal handle of a fly swatter. But the flat plastic square that actually swats the flies, that part had melted off. Inspectors found other plastic objects in the living room that were warped or liquefied, but there was plenty of other stuff inside the house that should have melted, but for some reason didn't. There was a plastic model of an old sailing vessel that sat on the coffee table, not far from the fly swatter and pill bottles.
Ano subject yan?
As good as new. There was also a stack of cassette tapes that sat next to the stereo that looked unaltered and ready to be played. The right side of the living room opened out into a small kitchen. George had decorated the sides of the refrigerator with wallpaper.
Malakas ka pala, tamang segue lang. 1 pa naman yung quiz, kaya pa yan.
The refrigerator was a totally different story. The butter was completely melted, along with the plastic butter dish. In the meat drawer was an unopened package of hot dogs, and they were all cooked. The inspectors struggled to comprehend what actually happened. How could a refrigerator turn into an oven on the inside, while the outside of it was totally unaffected by the heat? And things got even weirder as the inspectors moved to the back of the house to George's bedroom. As they stepped inside, inspectors could see the TV on George's wooden dresser was caved in on the top, where the plastic shell had melted down into itself. But the dresser it was sitting on was good as new, aside from the layer of soot that covered it. In the corner of the bedroom was George's oxygen machine. Not only was it undamaged by the heat, it was still running.
Dali lang ba yung quiz na yan, Jules?
Resting on top of that machine was George's plastic oxygen mask. Unlike the television, the mask had not melted. This was made all the more strange because the mask and the machine were just inches from the bed, where clearly an intense fire
Update kita pag gising si Gaga.
Now the fire is out.
Sim. Sige. Baltaan mo ko, be.
The wooden bed frame was charred in places, but it was still standing up. The mattress, however, was totally destroyed. The stuffing was all burnt up, and the net of metal mattress springs were melted in a way that made them curve down into a V shape under the bed. You could actually see through those springs and underneath the bed, where a large hole had burned through the floorboards. But as the inspectors crouched down to take a closer look into that hole, they could see that something else had burned up in this strange fire. Tangled in the mattress springs was a man's foot, burned off near the ankle. Near the headboard was a charred fragment of a human skull. Beyond that, they found tiny piles of fine black ash in the wreckage of the bed, as well as
wow, bigatin. Basic pala ang tropa. Anong subject ba yan?
Before he died, George was a pretty big, sturdy guy, weighing in over 180 pounds. What was left of him now weighed about 3 pounds, easily fitting inside a shoebox. The confusion amongst the inspectors only continued to grow after finding George. George wasn't just burned. He essentially had been cremated. Cremation is the process where a dead body is
kahapon, my quiz. Parehas lang yan, same shit.
Hot fire that burns inside of a special oven. Yet somehow, here George was, reduced to ash by this bizarre fire that only affected small portions of the house. It just didn't add up. If the temperature in the bedroom was hot enough to cremate George, how on earth was the house even still standing? But there was yet another mystery hanging over the scene. How did a fire as powerful as this one get ignited in the first place? The inspectors checked the electrical outlets, they checked the gas lines that ran in the crawl space under George's bedroom, they completely dismantled the gas furnace that straddled the bedroom and the living room, and they could not find a single shred of physical evidence that might explain how George caught on fire. A few days later, the New York State police inspectors finally just gave up. They couldn't see any signs that foul play had occurred, so they filed a final report that simply stated that George's death was, quote, accidental. Then they closed the book on the case. But there was one inspector with the Essex County Fire Department who wasn't ready to give up so fast. That man's name was Tony Moret. Tony was 37 years old and worked in the fire department.
Mr. Ballin. Hey there, Stevie. Good morning. Well, good evening to you. I was at your stream as well. I was looking around.
He was determined to find out what really happened to his
Good evening. How was your stream earlier? How did it go?
They found at the scene of the fire, Tony was puzzled by one more thing. He knew George was obsessed with fire safety. Tony just couldn't believe that George would be careless enough to accidentally set himself on fire. But after hundreds of hours exploring every possibility for what could have happened to George, he was
thank you. It's not bad. No, it's good to hear.
About the science of fire,
any significant progress today?
Rules seemed to apply to what he was observing inside of George's house. Finally, one of Tony's colleagues gave him a tip about an organization down in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania that might be able to help. They were called Parascience International, and they specialized in the study of strange phenomena that couldn't be explained by traditional science. Tony was hesitant at first. When he thought of the paranormal,
not really.
Like Bigfoot,
it's just a daily grind.
The Loch Ness Monster.
The daily
him,
small bits.
That believed in those sorts of things was an organization he couldn't really take seriously. But he was desperate to find out what happened to George, and his own investigation had reached a dead end, and so he didn't really have anything to lose by considering a different perspective, even if it was totally unorthodox. So, in April of 1986, a few weeks after George's ashes were discovered, Tony took a deep breath, then picked up the phone and made the call to Parascience International.
They say Hollywood is where dreams
Oh man, got an
are made,
ad.
a seductive city where many flock to get
What a
rich, be
shame.
adored, and capture America's heart. But when the spotlight turns off, fame, fortune, and lives can disappear in an instant. When TV producer Roy Radin was found dead in a canyon near LA in 1983,
Ooh, that
there
fits
were
so
many
nice.
questions surrounding his death. The last person seen with him was Lainey Jacobs, a seductive
A9.
cocaine dealer who desperately wanted to be
A9
part of the
A10?
Hollywood elite.
Gotcha.
Together, they were trying to break into the movie industry. But things took a dark turn when $1 million worth of cocaine and cash went missing.
Damn.
From Wondery comes a new season of the hit show Hollywood and Crime, The Cotton Club Murder. Follow Hollywood and Crime, The Cotton
Hollywood
Club Murder on the
and
Wondery
Crime.
app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of The Cotton Club Murder early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus.
When the phone rang
There
400
we go,
miles
we're
away
back.
in Harrisburg, it was answered by a man named Larry Arnold. Larry was a 37-year-old school bus driver during the day, but in his off time, he devoted many hours to this group of parascience experts. For the last
Nasaan
10
assignment mo?
years, Larry had worked
Ay, kailan ba,
with
Ju?
them to
Di ba bukas
investigate
pa?
many
Feb 5
strange
pa?
and unusual events. But Larry's greatest passion was studying fire phenomena that
Kailan ba, Ju?
defied explanation.
Feb 4,
So
1
when
p.m.
Tony told Larry
1 p.m.
what he
pa.
needed help with, Larry
May
was
oras pa ako.
immediately interested. Larry listened intently
Gawin ko mamaya.
as Tony flooded him with details about the strange case of George Mott. The body reduced to fine ash, the lack of damage to things near the body, the inexplicable
Maaga pa, be.
pattern of melting and burning
Sim.
throughout the house. The more
Yeah.
Larry heard, the more intrigued he became.
Ba't ko gagawin yun kung
So,
pwede
by
ko
the
naman
end of this
ipagpamamaya?
call, Larry
Why do
said
it now if I
he
can do it
took
later,
Crown Point,
right?
Examine George's house and see if he could make any sense of it. And a few weeks later, that's just what Larry did. When he arrived in Crown Point, he met with Tony at George's home.
Okay,
It had been
nice.
over a month since the fire, but George's family was still in shock
Nice
and
and
were
easy.
totally undecided about what to do with the house, so the inside really wasn't all that
8:27.
different from the way the inspectors first found it.
28.
As soon as he stepped through the door and into the living room, Larry noticed that the shelves and the tabletops all had a strange glaze on them. It wasn't just soot or ash that you could brush away with your hand. It was almost
Iisa naman
like
sabgot
baked
ko makatambay ko sa
melted
kali. Sige,
caramel.
sige. In the afternoon pag-uwi
Right
mo.
away, a picture began to form in Larry's mind of what could have happened the day George caught
G
on fire.
lang.
And so Larry headed straight to the back of the house and into George's bedroom. George's remains had been removed, but Larry could still see the area that had burned and how it hadn't spread beyond the bed and the hole in the floorboards. Larry, like every other inspector who had been inside of George's home, couldn't find anything nearby that could have possibly ignited the blaze, but to Larry Arnold, that actually wasn't the least bit surprising. Tony and the other investigators had never seen anything as confounding as this case, but Larry had. It was extremely rare, but in his research for Parascience International, Larry had
Parascience.
uncovered about 200 recorded cases that were similar to George Mott's. For example, in the year 1725, a Parisian innkeeper found his wife had burned down to a pile of ashes in the middle of their kitchen floor. Nothing around her was damaged from this fire, not even the wooden cooking utensils that laid close to her charred
Oh,
remains.
interesting nung
In
case.
1951, a landlady visited one of the tenants of her apartment building in St. Petersburg, Florida. When she grabbed the doorknob, she found it hot to the touch, and when she opened the door, she found the tenant's body had been incinerated into ashes, except for her skull and one of her feet. Inches away from the body was a pile of newspapers
Oh,
that showed
right?
no signs of burning. Another example, in 1970, an 89-year-old widow was found burnt down into a pile of ashes in her home in Dublin, Ireland. The only recognizable remains were her 2 feet, which were burnt off near the ankles. She had a
I don't think
vase
I'm
with
doing it
plastic
right.
flowers sitting on a table in the center of the room. the flowers had melted into a puddle, but everything else in the room appeared to be more or less untouched.
Wait.
In nearly all of these
Nawawala
similar
yung
cases, Larry noted the same common threads. There was often a strange, sweet smell reported, and a weird, ashy glaze that seemed to coat everything. There was very little damage to the space surrounding the burned remains, and there was no clear indication of what could have possibly ignited the blaze in the first place.
What color was it?
For hundreds of years, scientists and scholars had been developing theories behind how these strange fire events could happen.
The thing fell.
The only feasible explanation they could come up with was that these intense fires were actually ignited from inside the bodies of the victims.
Ito pala. Wait
Back in the 1800s, many believed this was God's judgment delivered to those who led an immoral life. Some thought it could be a byproduct of alcoholism, with the excess alcohol increasing the body's flammability. As the decades passed, many other theories have also been put forward to explain how a human body that is 60% water could spontaneously ignite. Larry Arnold had his own theories. He knew the human body was full of electrical activity that pulsed through the brain, the nervous system, and through every heartbeat, so what if the electricity somehow got amplified? Could the body start an explosive electrical fire that burnt itself out from the inside? Could it burn fast enough and hot enough that it incinerated the victim without burning anything nearby? Whatever the cause, this strange and rare event eventually became so widely known that it got its own name. Spontaneous human combustion.
Oh yeah. Is that it? Is that the case? Oh, the thing isn't looping.
When Tony heard Larry's theory, he thought it sounded crazy, but he also thought it made more sense than any other explanation he'd heard for what happened to George. By the time Tony officially finished his own investigation into the death of George Mott, he concluded that the cause was spontaneous human combustion. But despite Tony's support of this theory, the official reports by police never changed for George Mott. His death is still listed as accidental, with no mention of spontaneous human combustion. While there are many believers in the theory, the vast majority of scientists dismiss spontaneous human combustion as pseudoscience that is unsupported by physical evidence. And the physical evidence in this case is still contradictory and confusing.
E1 to be N4.
But despite not fully understanding what happened, for instance, why the outside of George's refrigerator was untouched while the hot dogs inside were cooked through, Larry felt confident in his conclusion that George Mott was indeed a victim of spontaneous human combustion. According to the wishes of George's family, his ashes were sent to a crematorium, along with his foot and what was left of his skull. Then, after that second burning, George Mott was scattered at sea and finally laid to rest.
Is that it? Is that the episode? That was a short one.
Thank you for listening to Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries.
It's been 20 minutes? Oh, fuck.
Be sure to come back next week because we put out a brand new mind-boggling medical mystery each week.
Oh my god. Where did the thing...
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Matt Olmos. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomaneng. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Additional support from Natalie Shisha. Senior producers are Laura Donna Polivoda, Dave Schilling, and Matt Olmos. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.
He was hip-hop's biggest mogul, the man who redefined fame, fortune, and the music industry.
The first male rapper to be honored on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
lived a life most people only dream about.
And so many
Ain't no
ads.
party like a Diddy party, son.
Hey Prime members, you can binge episodes 65 through 70. The normally gentle animal had gone, and time the farmer tried to grab him by the collar, the dog snapped at him and then went back to running in its crazy circles. But suddenly, the dog stopped running.
Ay, ba't isa
He sniffed
kasha?
at the ground, then
Ito
bit
hindi.
down on a rock and chewed on it so hard his mouth started to bleed. Nothing the farmer did
hell?
could get him to stop. The dog just kept chewing on more and more
Ayun.
rocks until blood was running down
easy.
his mouth and his teeth were starting to fall
Here.
out. What the farmer couldn't know as he watched his beloved dog go crazy was that only 2 days later, he, the farmer, would be the one running around that same yard, screaming incoherently like a madman. It was an inexplicable horror that would spread throughout the entire village,
Time for
and
the
no
West.
one would know how to stop it.
The what? The one
They
and
say
three.
Hollywood is where dreams are made. A seductive city where many flock to get rich, be adored, and capture America's heart. But when the spotlight turns off, fame, fortune, and lives can disappear in an instant. Follow
Ewan.
Hollywood and Crime, The Cotton Club Murder on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
In the depths of an Atlanta forest, a clash between activists and authorities ends in tragedy. I'm Matthew Scher, and on my new podcast, We Came to the Forest. We expose the hidden truths
daming
behind a
ads.
shootout that left
And this means, and put them down for the song My Way by Frank Sinatra. Dr. Albert Gabay drove his car through the
Ayan.
narrow
Oh, it's
streets
playing
of a
now.
village in the south of France. He had just spent a relaxing week with his family in the Pyrenees, which is a mountain range that runs along the border between France and Spain. His wife and 4 kids were still at their mountain cabin, enjoying their vacation, but Dr. Gabay had to reopen his office and return to work. Now, after a long drive, he was finally back in his
Okay, this is
hometown
nice.
of Pont Saint-Esprit.
This is a good technique.
His route took him along a street that had been heavily bombed during World War II. He drove past gray stone buildings that stood next to piles of stone rubble. In the distance, he could see the Rhone River sparkling in the afternoon sun. He
Then
turned a corner and spotted his friend, the grocer, who stood in the doorway of his store greeting customers. Dr. Gabay waved hello through his car window and continued on his way. Further into town, he slowed to a stop so that the baker could carry sacks of flour across the street.
tapos
Dr. Gabay loved this town, where he had lived his entire
What?
life. Pont Saint-Esprit was small enough that there were only 2 other doctors besides him who worked there. It was a friendly place where everyone seemed to know each other. Not long ago, Dr. Gabay had wondered if he'd be forced to leave Pont Saint-Esprit.
Then
During World War II, the village was occupied by the German army. Then Allied forces sent in warplanes to bomb the German troops. It was a
B222.
terrifying ordeal, and the recovery had
Which
been
one's
slow,
B again,
but the
Chad?
doctor was optimistic that
gold?
the village would one day be fully restored to its
I don't
former
remember.
glory. The sun was low in the sky when Dr. Gabay turned into a small
No,
courtyard
it's
and
white.
parked his car.
It's this one.
His home and medical office shared a stone building in the center of the village.
This one.
As he carried his suitcase towards the front door, Dr. Gabay was looking forward to eating a simple dinner and getting to bed early. But when he opened the door, his housekeeper, who had arrived earlier to tidy up, rushed to greet him with a concerned look on her face. Before she could say anything, Dr. Gabay stopped in surprise. The waiting room of his first-floor office was jammed full of people. The small room had a dozen wood chairs pushed up against the walls, and every seat was filled. Old men leaned their heads back against the wall with their eyes closed. Some mothers held children in their
Then
laps, and other children were
28 and
sprawled on the floor.
13.
Dr. Gabay recognized one entire family. Everyone looked
28
clammy and
and
pale.
13.
He took a breath and frowned. The room had a sharp and unpleasant odor. His housekeeper explained that over the last few hours, sick people kept showing up asking to see him. She told them that she wasn't sure what time he would return, but they decided to wait for him anyway.
28.
There was clearly something going around in the village, and Dr. Gabay wanted to be sure he wasn't dealing with a serious outbreak. Dinner would have to wait. Dr. Gabay headed for the exam room and told his housekeeper to send in the first patient.
Oh.
Over the next several hours, Dr. Gabay examined them one by one. Their complaints were identical: upset stomach, nausea, and chills. And so it seemed very likely that they all had mild cases of food poisoning. Dr. Gabay thought it was odd that so many people got hit with it at once, but he was sure there was a reasonable explanation for that. There had been a lot of problems with the food supply as France struggled to recover from the war, so it wasn't unusual for people to come down with food poisoning every once in a while. The treatment for it was simple. Most people just needed a few days' rest to make a full recovery. Dr. Gabay gave the patients some medicine to settle their stomachs and assured them that they would feel better soon. It would take several hours to get to every single patient, but when the last one had left his office, Dr. Gabay slowly made his way up the stairs to finally eat his dinner. He called his wife to explain what was going on, and after he was done reassuring her, he climbed right into bed and fell asleep. At 11 o'clock the next morning, Dr. Gabay was standing in the kitchen of a farmhouse with the family who lived there. Half of the family had been sick in his waiting room the evening before. Dr. Gabay didn't usually work on Saturdays, but he thought it would be good to check in on some of the patients he had seen. This was his second house call of the morning. He had looked over the family members one by one, and he was now examining a skinny boy dressed in a nightshirt. The boy said he felt better today, and Dr. Gabay smiled. He was glad that most of his patients seemed to be doing better. But something didn't feel quite right to Dr. Gabay. Even before he stopped in to see this boy and his family, he had started to wonder if something other than food poisoning was troubling the residents of Pont Saint-Esprit. For one thing, he had questioned all of the patients, but he still hadn't figured out what they had all eaten that could have made them all sick. But there was another thing Dr. Gabay noticed that was even stranger. The farmhouse's kitchen had an incredibly unpleasant odor. It was the same one that had filled his waiting room the day before. It took a while before the doctor could put his finger on where he had smelled it before. It was years ago in his own house. Some mice had been living inside his bedroom wall, but then the mice died, and it took several days for the smell of decay to go away. That dead mouse odor, like a mixture of rotten cabbage and sulfur, was what he was smelling when he was around some of his patients. This farmhouse, like all of the houses he visited that morning, was clean. Its windows were open, and the smell of warm bread from the nearby bakery was coming in with the summer breeze. There was no evidence of mice anywhere. But for the moment, Dr. Gabay didn't have time to think about it too much. Just before noon, after finishing his house calls, the weary doctor returned to his office, and his waiting room was full again. All the patients were again showing signs of food poisoning, and all had that same horrible smell. Whatever had happened was clearly not an isolated event. Dr. Gabay had to get to the bottom of it before things got out of hand.
Okay, ano kaya yun?
At 11 o'clock that night, Dr. Gabay was still in his office doing paperwork when there was a knock on his door. He opened it to find one of the other doctors in the village standing there. His name was Dr. Vieux, and he looked completely exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. Dr. Vieux told him that he had also seen a lot of patients with symptoms of food poisoning while Dr. Gabay was away on vacation, and that the number of patients had begun to rise the day before Dr. Gabay came back to town. Dr. Gabay sighed and rubbed his temples. Unfortunately, the third doctor in the village was sick with the illness going around town and couldn't get out of bed. So it was up to Dr. Vieux and Dr. Gabay to handle whatever was happening. The two doctors could only handle so much. If more people got sick, they might not be able to take care of them all. The two doctors started to compare notes. Dr. Vieux had also noticed that a lot of his patients were emitting the same awful odor of dead mice that Dr. Gabay had smelled, and Dr. Vieux was just as mystified. On top of that, over the course of the day, both doctors had noted that some of their patients had symptoms that were so bizarre, they didn't know how to start treating them. Their skin was growing pale, their pupils were dilated, and they struggled to keep their minds focused. It was so bad that several of them said they were no longer able to read. Whatever this disease was, it wasn't normal food poisoning. As the doctors wrapped up their meeting, they realized that between them, they had seen at least 230 patients in the last few days. In a town with a population of just 4,000, that was a huge number. They agreed that it was time to notify the authorities, since the situation could stretch the town's resources. Before leaving, Dr. Vieux stopped in the doorway and made a confession. He wasn't feeling well himself and wondered if he was coming down with the same illness as everyone else. As Dr. Gabay
File
closed the
natin
door,
onte.
he tried to stay calm and keep focused on the facts. He was relieved that he didn't feel sick, he just felt tired. But a
Konti
medical
lang.
crisis was clearly emerging
Konti
in
lang.
Pont Saint-Esprit, and now it looked like Dr. Gabay might be the only doctor healthy enough to handle it. With those heavy thoughts weighing on him, at 2 in the morning, Dr. Gabay sat back down at his desk to catch up on his notes. Not long after, the phone rang. It was the wife of a local farmer named Felix Meissen. Dr. Gabay had made a visit to their home earlier on Saturday.
Ay natin sa
when he
gitna
was
kaya
taking house
kaikot.
calls.
Yun na nga, nakakatakot
Felix's
kaya.
condition seemed to be improving, but now he could hear panic in the voice of
I
Felix's
agree.
wife.
I'm scared.
She said that Felix could hardly breathe or talk, and that he was acting like a madman. Within minutes, Dr. Gabay was in his car,
I am
speeding
scared.
through dark country roads towards the farmhouse. Felix's wife met him at the door. She said that shortly after Dr. Gabay left their house on Saturday, Felix suddenly jumped up out of bed and ran out into the yard.
Scurry.
Then he burst back in and rolled back and forth on his bed, screaming at the top of his lungs.
Spill the wings.
Now, 12 hours later, he was curled up in a ball on the mattress, struggling to
Proud
breathe.
defender.
Dr. Gabay went immediately to the bedside to examine him. Felix was lying motionless, his breathing loud and ragged. He seemed barely conscious and didn't respond when Dr.
podcast ba
Gabay
sa
spoke to
DB na
him.
yun?
His pupils were dilated.
Wala
and his
be, walang
temperature was
official
normal.
ano yun,
Dr.
walang
Gabay worried that Felix's
walang
heart was going to
debut
give
yun,
out
ano
if
lang
he didn't
yun.
get treatment as soon as
Kung nandun ka,
possible.
nandun
The
ka,
closest
yun na
hospital
yun.
that could handle this kind of emergency
Walang
was
ano
an
yan.
hour's drive south in a city called Nîmes. Dr. Gabay
Iwan
called for an
yan.
ambulance and then tended to
Boring.
Felix while they waited for it to arrive. The doctor was grasping
Oo,
for any
ano yun,
clue he could
compliance
find.
lang yun.
So he asked Felix's wife
For
what they'd
compliance
eaten in the past
purposes.
few days. Just what they always ate, she said. Summer stew, bread, cheese, and wine. But then she recalled that something terrible had happened at their house 2 days ago.
Labag
They
sa
found their
ano.
dog running in circles outside.
Ayun na nga kaya ka
Before they
magkakasurvey
knew it,
for
the dog
Chismis
was
eh.
chewing on rocks
Chismax
until
Ultra.
blood began pouring out of its mouth. Minutes later, their beloved pet went into convulsions and died. Dr. Gabay thought it was very possible that the dog's death was connected to the same illness that Felix and the others were all suffering from. If that was the case, the situation was even more serious than he thought. If the dog died, then people could die as well. The leaders of Pont Saint-Esprit needed to be alerted to the danger as
Okay.
soon as possible.
Tapos ay ito ay ilagay.
That evening, Dr. Gabay sat in a crowded and stuffy room in the town hall where a heated discussion was underway. It was Sunday now, and earlier that day, he had convinced the mayor to call an emergency meeting about this strange medical crisis with the municipal council, the police chief, and other city officials. But so
The
far,
emotion won't be
everyone
the same
was
kapag
just
hindi
arguing.
marinig ang aking silent
Dr. Gabay
tawa.
was frustrated.
Tang-
There were now at least
Alam mo,
280 people affected
Okay
with this
lang
bizarre
yan.
and
Pero
now
oo nga,
potentially
I think I
lethal
agree.
illness. And he was at his
I
limit.
think I
Dr.
agree.
Gabay had been working almost non-stop with very little sleep since he returned
Oh, wait,
from his
the emotion-
vacation over 40
Tama
hours
naman,
ago.
nasa ano
His eyes
naman,
burned with fatigue and his temper
nasa
rose.
voice call
He
naman
stood up and
para
made
may
sure his
attempt
voice was
marinig
strong,
yung
and he told
yung
everyone
tawa.
they needed to alert the town to the danger.
C11.
The mayor placed a hand on his shoulder. He was just as concerned as Dr. Gabay, but scientists and medical experts from nearby universities had been summoned to study the problem, and the remains of Felix Meissen's dog would be sent to the lab to be analyzed. The mayor felt the best course was to gather that data and then figure out what to tell the townspeople. Anything else would make everyone more panicked. Dr. Gabay grew even more impatient. He insisted that their analysis would take too much time. The danger was already here, and people needed to be warned now so they could protect themselves. But the mayor held his ground. What would they warn people about exactly? They still didn't even know what was causing the trouble. At this point, the mayor thought the so-called crisis consisted of a dead dog and multiple people with a stomach flu. And there was no proof that the two were even related. But there was one precaution that the mayor did want to take right away. Before adjourning the meeting, the mayor turned to the police chief. Given the number of people afflicted with the illness, they couldn't rule out the possibility that someone was deliberately poisoning the village. The police chief agreed to launch a criminal investigation right away, but he would need
F1
assistance from law enforcement officials in neighboring cities. meeting ended at 1 a.m., and Dr. Gabay started walking home, exhausted and frustrated. A criminal investigation seemed like a total waste of time to him. After all, why would
Depende lang
anyone
kung
be
pasado
launching
ako
such a
hindi.
vicious
Baka may
attack
bagsak ako siya
on their
pinatamlay.
tiny
Ayun
and
lang.
somewhat
Pasado
insignificant
yan,
town?
basic yun eh.
But then,
Ikaw
the
pa
more
ba?
he thought about it,
Eh,
the doctor
napakagaling mo.
supposed that a criminal motive could not really be ruled
Diba?
out. All he knew was that he needed to get home and sleep if he was
Galing-galing mo
going to
eh.
be of any
Siyempre.
help to his patients the next day.
Pasado yan.
But just as he entered the courtyard in front of his home, he heard high-pitched shrieks coming from the nearby grocery store. Dr. Gabay ran down the street to the store and pounded on the door. The grocer's wife was relieved to see him and brought him up the stairs to the family's apartment and into her daughter's room. There, on her bed, 5-year-old Marie Joseph Carl was writhing in agony. Her arms and legs were jerking, her fingers and toes clenched so tightly that they were white and bloodless. The doctor hurried to the child's side and tried to pry her toes open. In their rigid position, it was impossible for blood to flow properly, and her feet could be permanently damaged. Suddenly, Marie Joseph sat upright, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed at the air in front of her and screamed that tigers were coming to eat her. Dr. Gabay enlisted the mother's help to restrain the child, and then he gave Marie Joseph a shot of a sedative that he hoped would calm her down. The doctor rubbed his eyes and told the weeping mother that Marie Joseph had to be treated in a hospital and that he needed to call an ambulance. Dr. Gabay then walked down the hallway towards the kitchen where the phone was located, but as he stepped past the parents' bedroom, he stopped. There, inside the room, was the grocer, Mr. Carl, sitting up on his elbows in bed as he stared out the window. The doctor was confused as to why Mr. Carl wasn't tending to his daughter. The grocer seemed strangely preoccupied and disturbed. When Dr. Gabay stepped closer to him, he realized the grocer wasn't staring out the window. He was just staring
stupid.
at
Ayan,
as if in a
practice
trance.
kayong lahat
Mr. Carl
ng
held up his finger and
ng
softly
jungle.
counted the 6 panes embedded in the
Yan
window.
ang masaya.
He repeated the numbers over and over and over again. Dr. Gabay sniffed the air and detected that familiar
Ay, good night.
smell
Baka
of dead
gumising na yung
mice.
mga
It could only mean one
mag-aayos.
thing, that Mr. Carl
Okay.
had fallen ill as well.
Mga maayos,
After making
mag-aayos,
sure Mr. Carl was
maaayos.
comfortable, Dr. Gabay returned to
Sorry,
Marie
I'm
Joseph's
stupid
bedroom.
at times.
He expected her to be groggy from the sedative, maybe even asleep. Instead, he found the child alert and happy, as if she had been fully cured. The child looked at the doctor and smiled and told him that the tigers must have been a dream. The doctor checked her temperature and her pulse. She was totally back to normal. Instead of putting Marie Joseph to sleep, the sedative appeared to have completely cured her. Dr. Gabay shook his head. None of this made any sense. He decided to hold off calling the ambulance, thinking Marie Joseph could now fully recover at home. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Gabay said goodnight to the Carl family and staggered back to his house. As he opened his door, the phone was ringing. It was the hospital in Nîmes. Felix Meissen, the farmer, was dead. Whatever illness was attacking the town of Pont Saint-Esprit, it was fatal. This had officially turned into a full-blown medical catastrophe.
Okay.
He was hip-hop's biggest mogul, the man who redefined fame for
trafficking, interstate transportation for prostitution.
Enforcement officers swept into Pont Saint-Esprit.
Ayun na. Okay.
They stopped people on the street to ask questions, they interrogated shopkeepers, and closed some shops entirely. The presence of so many police officers alarmed people, and gossip began to fly around the village. Every person knew someone who was sick. Some people speculated that perhaps the rumors were true, and a madman or killer was poisoning the village. Maybe he poisoned the water, or perhaps the salt, or the meat, or some other food. Some people quietly packed and left town. By the end of the day, the once bustling center of the village was growing empty and quiet. Dr. Gabay watched families leaving from the door of his house. He thought of his own wife and kids who were still on vacation in the mountains. He'd spoken to them briefly at the start of this sickness, but he wanted to check in on them again. So he placed a phone call to the vacation house. His wife was shocked when he updated her about the terrifying events unfolding in their town. She worried that her husband would wear himself out or get the awful illness himself. Dr. Gabay told his wife that he was fine, and he believed that she and their kids were safe since they were out of town. However, he had a duty to continue to treat the people of his village. Dr. Gabay hung up the phone. The next day was Tuesday, 4 days since he had come home from vacation. By mid-morning, the delegation of university doctors and scientists had arrived. They collected food scraps and sent them out to be analyzed by a scientific laboratory to test for poison. And then they ordered an autopsy to be performed on Felix Meissen.
Okay.
Dr. Gabay tried to reassure his patients that they'd have answers soon. But in private, he worried about how long it was taking. It would be several days at least before the test results came back and the autopsy was complete. He couldn't stand the thought of more people dying as they waited. Not only that, but Dr. Gabay didn't know how long he could continue to work without rest, and there was still the possibility that he would get sick himself. As the weeks wore on, with still no news about the tests or the autopsy, Dr. Gabay saw dozens of patients in his office and crisscrossed the streets to visit the sicker patients at home. His phone rang every night with news of more strange symptoms emerging. Now, many of his patients seemed irrationally happy. They talked so quickly that it was impossible to understand them. But then, just as fast as the euphoria emerged, it would come crashing down, leaving the patients overcome with anguish. And then there were the patients who just couldn't sleep. Instead, they would gather in the street in the middle of the night. Dr. Gabay could hear them from his window, chatting and laughing with a strange, frenetic energy. Others he could see wandering aimlessly through the dark streets, silent and lost. It was as if Pont Saint-Esprit had become haunted and cursed. The village priest prayed to saints to lift the curse from the town. Dr. Gabay wasn't superstitious, but it made him remember a disease he had read about many years before. It was called St. Anthony's Fire, a sickness that happened back in the Middle Ages and caused entire villages to go mad, just like he was seeing in Pont Saint-Esprit. Back then, many people believed that it was a curse from the devil. Dr. Gabay was a man of science, and he wondered if there could be a connection. At this point, a supernatural explanation from the 15th century was as good as any other. Dr. Gabay shook his head. This was modern France, and medicine didn't operate on hunches. The most pressing thing right now was for the toxicology lab to finish its work. In the meantime, he would continue to treat his patients as well as he could, and he would look up old diseases once he had some free time. He hoped this would be soon. Once the lab had an answer, he would know how to treat the disease, everyone would get better, and he would have enough time to pursue his hunches. Instead, he'd find out things could still get much, much worse. It was Friday evening, just 1 week since Dr. Gabay had returned from his vacation. He was in his car following an ambulance that carried little Marie Joseph Carl. Her delirious visions of tigers had returned, and she had become so violent that her mother had to tie her to the bed. Dr. Gabay had watched helplessly as the 5-year-old was loaded into an ambulance, kicking and screaming. As he parked his car in front of the old hospital in Pont Saint-Esprit, he noticed that every light in the building was blazing. As he walked to the entrance, Dr. Gabay saw a man appear in a second-floor window, waving his arms wildly. And then, to Dr. Gabay's horror, the man climbed out the window and stood on the ledge. 2 nurses quickly crept up behind him, begging him to get back in the room. But every time they reached out, the man smacked their hands away. Then the man stretched out his arms and proclaimed that he was an airplane and that he could fly. And then he jumped.
Damn.
He landed with his feet on the pavement, and immediately there was this deafening crack as both of his legs snapped in half. The man screamed in agony as he lay on his back. But suddenly, the man's energy shifted. It was as if he pushed the pain right out of his body and replaced it with intense anger. Somehow, the man with the 2 broken legs rose up and then took off running full speed down the boulevard. Dr. Gabay couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could anyone run on 2 totally broken legs?
Good question.
And this was only the beginning of the night that seemed to Dr. Gabay like an apocalypse. He entered the hospital to find the wards packed full of screaming, struggling patients. His patients, who had seemed to be getting better, were now totally psychotic. Many screamed that their hands and feet were on fire. Some fought desperately against imaginary enemies in the air. The odor of dead mice was now overwhelming. Dr. Gabay was on the brink of collapse. He started to wonder if he himself had gotten sick. Was he hallucinating or going crazy? Dr. Gabay considered whether he should just give up and finally get the sleep he so desperately needed. But ultimately, he knew that quitting was a violation of his oath as a doctor, and the residents of Pont Saint-Esprit were counting on him, so he chose to soldier on. He put out an order that Marie Joseph be sent to another hospital 30 miles away in Avignon, where he hoped it would be calmer. Then he tried injecting some of the victims with sedatives, hoping to quiet them since it had worked before with Marie Joseph. But the sedatives had absolutely no effect on their ferocious behavior. The strength and violence of the patients was beyond belief. They were dangerous to themselves and to everyone around them. One patient sprung up from his bed, punching and kicking at everyone around him. It took 14 men to hold him down. While that was happening, several other patients broke away from their rooms and tried to jump out windows or run through walls. Dr. Gabay saw no option but to immobilize patients in straitjackets and send them to be locked up in a psychiatric hospital. But then the hospital ran out of straitjackets. Nurses tied patients to their beds with ropes and twine, where they lay screaming in horror. When they ran out of rope, the nurses used horses' reins. But the restraints didn't hold. One by one, victims broke away and ran back out into the hospital garden, where they uprooted tomato stakes and wielded them like swords against each other. Dr. Gabay worked through the night trying to treat the injuries that patients had inflicted on themselves. One of these patients was the man who had leapt out of the window and broken both of his legs. It took 8 men to hold him down as Dr. Gabay set his fractures. As he worked, Dr. Gabay noticed that the man's toes were rigid and bluish-green. Over the course of this long and horrible night, it seemed like every patient he had seen had toes and fingers that were stiff and lifeless. Dr. Gabay paused as the screaming and mayhem continued all around him. He thought of Marie Joseph's rigid hands and feet. He thought of the terrible smell that reminded him of dead mice. He thought again of the Middle Ages and the curse of St. Anthony's fire. And then a picture started to come into focus in his mind. He would need the lab results to prove it, but he believed he had just figured out what was causing this horrific sickness. And it tied all the way back to the medieval plague of St. Anthony's fire.
Oh my god, keeps getting good.
It took several days for Dr. Gabay and the medical investigators to fully uncover the truth, but they discovered that it had all started in an unassuming shop in the center of Pont Saint-Esprit. At noon on Thursday, August 16th, the day before Dr. Gabay returned from vacation, the village baker, Roche Brion, completed the third and last batch of bread of the day. Roche had been a baker in Pont Saint-Esprit for 30 years. Every household in the village bought at least one fresh loaf of bread every day, and many thought that Roche's bread was the best in town. However, on that day, August 16th, Roche was not pleased with the quality of his product. As he kneaded the dough, he noticed that the color was slightly gray. There had been complaints about the bread recently. He blamed the flour, which had been delivered to him by the government agency that supplied flour to bakeries all over France. Ever since the war, the flour had been of bad quality. It was usually wheat flour mixed with flour made from rye grain and dried beans. Sometimes it even contained dust and insects. That day he was making the bread, the baker knew that the dough just seemed a little off. Still, every time he tasted it, he thought it tasted fine. So he baked the bread, put it out for sale, and decided he'd lodge a protest with the flour suppliers the next morning. All day Thursday, people streamed into his shop for their bread, and again all day Friday and Saturday. Before dawn on Sunday, Roche and his wife were feeling a little nauseous, but they decided to take an overnight trip to see their kids who were spending the summer out of town. When Roche and his wife returned to Pont Saint-Esprit on Monday, the epidemic was in full swing. His bakery had been closed by the police, and Roche's wife was now so ill that she went straight to bed. When the police concluded their investigations, they confirmed that everyone who got sick had bought bread from Roche's bakery. What Roche didn't know was that a portion of the rye grain that was used by the government to dilute the flour was bad. It had gotten damp in the field and a fungus had grown on it. That fungus had been ground up with the rest of the grain as it was turned into flour. And this flour ended up in a sack that was delivered to Roche's bakery to use for making his bread. This fungus was incredibly resilient. It not only survived being ground into flour, it also survived the high heat of Roche's bakery oven. It laid dormant in the crusty brown loaves Roche sold to his customers, and then when Roche's customers ate their bread, this fungus entered their bodies. The fungus caused their stomachs to cramp, made it impossible to sleep, and caused people to feel like their hands and feet were burning. It also triggered hallucinations of tigers and airplanes and flying. It even made dogs turn on their owners and think that rocks were food. In fact, it had affected all sorts of animals, including pigs, ducks, and cats. All of these bizarre responses were triggered by chemicals in the fungus. One of these chemicals was lysergic acid, from which lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, is made. LSD is a very powerful hallucinogen.
Damn.
On top of all of this, when people ate the fungus, it set off a response in their bodies that cut off circulation to their limbs. The terrible stink that reminded Dr. Gabai of dead mice was actually the smell of his patient's fingers and toes slowly rotting with gangrene. This gangrene was well known in the Middle Ages when it was a symptom of the plague known as St. Anthony's Fire. Now, hundreds of years later, in 1951, this same plague was running rampant through the village of Pont Saint-Esprit long after the disease had passed out of memory. The fungus was known as ergot, and the illness it caused was known to modern medicine as ergotism. Ultimately, 7 people died and nearly 300 people were sickened in the ergotism outbreak in Pont Saint-Esprit. It took several months for the disease to run its course. Most patients slowly got better and were able to resume their normal lives. The baker, Roche, was at first suspected of intentionally poisoning the village, but was later found to be blameless. The memory of the 1951 poisoning still haunts the village. The official investigations went on for years. Finally, it was agreed that the people of Pont Saint-Esprit had indeed been under the influence of some kind of hallucinatory substance contained in the flour. How the substance got into the flour remains under debate to this day.
F17. 4, 5, 6. What? Is that specifically F17?
From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Heather Dundas and
that was a
edited
good
by
episode.
Alex Benedon. Sound design is by Andre Bruce. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf. Fact-checking was done by Jacqueline Coletti. For Ballin Studio. Hey Prime members.
Siyempre skip natin yung unang...
Please. On the hot evening of September 20th, 1987, 37-year-old Maria Ferreira hosted a lively family gathering at her small home in Goiânia, Brazil. Goiânia was a cosmopolitan city with nearly 1 million people. Gleaming skyscrapers and tropical fruit trees lined the wealthy downtown area. But there were also areas of extreme poverty. Maria and her husband, Davayer, lived in one of these lower-income neighborhoods where they owned and operated a scrapyard on their property. It was hard work, especially in the intense tropical heat. But Maria and Davayer made a great team. Maria liked to joke that even though Davayer was short and stocky, he always had his head in the clouds. Davayer would tease Maria when she took things too seriously, saying that that was why she had a gray streak in her long brown hair. But on this night, Maria was totally relaxed. There was plenty of delicious food and drink with people she loved, and they were able to pay for it because they had a little extra money from selling more scrap metal than usual. Maria and Davayer had also acquired a rare good luck charm a few days earlier. They never had much in the way of material possessions, but they tried to find beauty in their everyday life. This time, it was in a trinket Davayer had found. As they passed it around the table, she felt grateful for all the good fortune that had come their way. In the chair next to Maria, Davayer scooped a spoonful of black bean and pork stew onto his plate. He was listening to his brother, who was a bus driver, tell a story. He always had something funny to share from one of his routes. Devayer's other brother, Ivo, was there as well with his wife and their 6-year-old daughter, Lei Ji. The little girl's big brown eyes and joyful laugh filled Maria with love. Lei Ji was the closest thing she had had to a daughter since she didn't have any children of her own.
Okay. The hell?
It was the perfect night, and that called for a toast. Once everyone refilled their glasses, Maria raised hers in the air and thanked her family for coming. They all cheered and drank to the future. Later, after everyone left, Devayer went into the garage to finish up some work. As Maria washed coffee cups and put away plates, she could hear thunder in the distance. The next morning, on September 21st, Maria woke to the sound of rain pelting her tin rooftop. Goiânia's rainy season normally ran from October to April, but this year it had started earlier than usual. As Maria climbed out of bed, she noticed that she didn't feel well. Her body was stiff and her stomach felt upset. She wrote off her discomfort to the previous night's festivities and tried to carry on with her day. But as time passed, Maria was starting to feel increasingly sick until finally, after a few hours, she started violently vomiting. Now, the pain in Maria's stomach was so bad that she decided she needed to see a doctor right away. She slowly got dressed and walked out to tell Devayer. Maria found him working in the scrapyard. It was cluttered with old refrigerators, large pieces of sheet metal, and disassembled machines. Devayer offered to take her, but she said she didn't want to distract him from his work, so she told him she could get there on her own. Maria took a bus to a nearby hospital and was able to see a doctor right away. After the doctor examined her, he said everything was fine. She must be having an allergic reaction to something she ate. Maria was relieved it wasn't something more serious. She found it hard to believe she could be this sick from food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and once she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs, but whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Devayer's house, and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Lei Ji, to come join them. But Lei Ji was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Lei Ji did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Lei Ji threw up. Then, later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now, that included Devayer, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother, who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of Devayer's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and Devayer. 2 of Devayer's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger.
Ano
And
kaya
so,
yun?
on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was, she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. Devayer wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus, and about a half hour
Buti may bus na pala
later,
nun,
they
no?
got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria dropped the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking,
Ano kaya
and
yung
she noticed
item?
his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that right now, she just needed to see a doctor. But he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And, just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis, but she didn't know what else to do, so she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease. And her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she'd developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus.
Ano naman ng bag?
Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her, and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly.
Oh no.
This could be a dangerous situation.
Oh no.
The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face the more they talked. Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her, and then she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick.
So what was it?
The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Goiânia, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger.
Dali. Kasi iniwan sa Iniwan sa fucking
I'm Sarah Trelevin.
Oh my
and for
god, there's a
over
fucking
year, I've
ad.
been working on one of the most complex.
Seemed like that was frustrated at the public health office.
Okay, keep going.
Before he entered the courtyard, he pulled a device out of a case. The device would reveal if their terrible suspicions were correct. He carefully switched on the piece of equipment, but right away it seemed like the device was malfunctioning. And no matter how much Dr. Ferreira struggled to adjust the equipment, it just wouldn't work. The readings were just so impossible that he assumed it had to be broken.
Damn, okay, so it's not broken.
Dr. Ferreira was frustrated. Now he would need to go back to his office and swap out this broken device for a new one. So he let the receptionist know he'd be back as soon as possible. Almost 2 hours later, Dr. Ferreira returned with a replacement piece of equipment. When he turned that
Tas
one
ganun
on,
din yung
the
result.
exact same thing happened.
Dali.
The readings were impossible. He tried turning it on and off several times, but he just kept getting these totally incredible readings.
Ibig sabihin nun,
After a few
yun
minutes,
talaga.
Dr. Ferreira was horrified to realize that he had been wrong. Both of these devices had been working perfectly fine, and that meant the reality of this situation was much, much worse. If this situation didn't get handled, the whole city of Goiânia could have a catastrophic health crisis on their hands, and maybe all of Brazil could have a health crisis on their hands. So Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to get to that bag. Dr. Ferreira ran inside the building and was met by the facility's director. Ferreira asked where this bag was, but the director explained that he had become concerned about the bag's contents, so he had called in the fire brigade for assistance. In fact, the firefighters were already there and were about to take the bag from the building's courtyard. Their plan was to dispose of it in a nearby stream. Dr. Ferreira ran into the courtyard and saw a group of firefighters surrounding the bag. He yelled for them to stop, and that if they threw it in the water, it would trigger a horrific disaster. He warned them not to touch it and insisted that everyone just evacuate the building. Once Dr. Ferreira was able to explain what was happening, the firefighters realized just how serious this situation was, and they helped him clear the area. But the day was far from over. Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to track down Maria and speak to her about the contents of this bag. He located her at a hospital, but her condition had now worsened to the point where she was just too weak to even talk. But she was able to instruct Dr. Ferreira to just go to her family's junkyard, where he would find her husband, and he could answer any questions the doctor might have. It was noon by the time Dr. Ferreira and his colleague got to Maria and Devaier's scrapyard. When they arrived, they saw Devaier working next to his garage. Dr. Ferreira introduced himself and tried to shake Devaier's hand, but Devaier politely refused, and then he showed them the inside of his hand, and there was this huge open sore on his palm.
Oh my god.
Dr. Ferreira looked at it and then immediately shot a look of worry at his colleague. The doctor knew this type of wound on Devaier's hand could only be caused by one thing.
Which
and
is?
It was the thing that Dr. Ferreira feared the most.
Which is? Oh my god.
Debayer told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning, around 10 a.m., a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Debayer said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption.
Oh my god.
There was also a small
Radiation
capsule
shit
shaped like an oversized thermos. Debayer thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Debayer examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Debayer paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage.
That's some
He left them
really
there
active
before heading
shit.
inside to eat
I
dinner.
heard lead.
Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Debayer opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule.
Okay, confirmed.
Debayer was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage.
I
so she
already
could
know
see
what
it
it's
too.
about.
When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Debayer. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to Debayer. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but Debayer was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family.
No, unfortunately.
Debayer was determined to continue examining this object.
Big mistake.
So he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powder. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all Debayer knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they never imagined.
High, good effort. It's fucking radioactive.
As Debayer told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, Debayer shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors, and each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. Small groups of people gathered around the capsule and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside.
Radiation.
Many touched the small pellets Debayer had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made Debayer determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of Debayer's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, Debayer gave the capsule to 2 of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets.
You done mess up
Debayer gave a brain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of Debayer's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection.
You done mess up,
the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she too became ill.
Oh my god.
Around that same time, Debayer had given some fragments to his brother Ivo. And later, Ivo's daughter, Leiji, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. Debayer also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors, who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder.
Dali.
So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told Devayer she was taking what was left of the powder and the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag, then she headed out with one of Devayer's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrapyards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked Devayer about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it.
Ayun. So
Devayer
saan
said he
kaya?
wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby.
Yan.
Dr. Ferreira turned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic.
Ayun.
The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137.
Dali.
When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments. But without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that Devayer found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger.
Dali.
Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the public health agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high they were literally off the charts.
Damn.
But the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Goiânia's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devayer bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic, where the blue powder was first discovered, was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Leiji, also died on the same day.
Yikes.
They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, Devayer's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they had received when they melted down the capsule for Devayer. While Maria's husband, Devayer, survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. Devayer died in 1994, 7 years later.
I mean, who would have recovered?
Thankfully, no one else died from the radiation exposure, but many others sustained amputations, severe burn scars, and lifelong medical conditions. The Goiânia incident remains one of history's deadliest disasters involving medical radiation.
Damn. Crazy. Sipin na nanahimik ka.
From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me.
Tapos yung driver nung
A quick
bus.
reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Lauren DeLille. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf.
Okay, next
Fact-checking was
episode.
done by Sheila. Hey Prime members, you can binge episodes 65 through 72 right now. Act with
Activists dead and count.
from if On this episode, we're going to cover 2 stories about families who are dealt cruel twists of fate. First, we'll meet a man in India who's being held captive by someone very close to him, and when he tries to break free, something terrible happens. In our second story, we go back in time to England in the 1800s, where a loving family is torn apart by a deadly disease that no one knows how to stop. Here is our first story, called Sanju's Belly. On a humid summer morning in June 1999, 36-year-old Sanju Bhagat was hard at work on a farm outside of Nagpur, a city in central India. The sun had just risen, and the air was already so hot that he found it hard to breathe. Sanju and a group of farmhands were hard at work tending to the soybean crops. He made his way through the field, stopping to catch his breath every few steps. Sanju moved a lot slower than his co-workers because of his massive belly. For the past 15 years, Sanju had struggled beneath the weight of his ever-growing stomach. At first, when he was in his early 20s, his family had thought he was just filling out a little, like all young men do when they become adults. But Sanju's stomach didn't stop growing. It kept getting bigger and bigger until it had swelled to the size of a massive watermelon. But his arms and legs stayed stick thin. He never understood why his belly kept growing since he didn't eat much. By the time Sanju reached his early 30s, he was in constant pain, and his family desperately wanted him to see a doctor. But he couldn't afford to take time off of work. Although, deep down, he had to admit he was a little scared of what the doctor might find. Sanju wiped the sweat from his eyes and told himself to keep moving. As he shoveled, he overheard another farmhand make a nasty joke about maternity clothes. A few men laughed. People liked to joke that he looked pregnant. Sanju had been relentlessly teased about his so-called pregnancy for years. His neighbors and his old childhood friends would point and laugh at him. He knew he should be used to it by now, but it still upset him. But his belly wasn't just a source of embarrassment for Sanju. The sheer weight of his stomach made even the simplest things, like getting up from a chair or bending over, very hard to do. Even now, as he pushed himself to keep up with the other men in the field, he could feel his back stiffening and his arms and shoulders aching. By midday, he felt ready to drop from physical exhaustion. The sun beat down on Sanju's head and he could feel his chest tighten. He tried to keep working, but today it was harder to breathe than usual. No matter how deeply he inhaled, he couldn't quite catch his breath. Finally, he dropped his shovel and doubled over, gasping for air. Sanju gathered what little strength he had left and stood up straight. He could feel other farm workers' eyes on him as he gathered his tools and headed home. It was the longest walk of Sanju's life. He felt humiliated and useless, but he was also afraid. He could barely take a breath. By the time he got to the small home he shared with his family, he nearly fell through the front door. The last thing he remembered was falling hard on the tile floor. Sanju's mother was fixing lunch in the kitchen when she heard a noise in the front of the house. She ran into the living room and found her son collapsed on the floor. She grabbed the phone and called an ambulance, then rushed to Sanju's side and knelt down beside him. She tried to roll him over on his back so he could breathe better, but it was very difficult because of his enormous stomach. She muttered every prayer she could think of, straining her ears for the sound of a siren. And finally, in the distance, she heard it. By the time the ambulance pulled up in front of their home, Sanju was barely breathing. The paramedics quickly assessed Sanju's condition. They put an oxygen mask on him, then strapped him to a gurney and loaded him up into an ambulance. Sanju's mother wanted to go with him, but the nearest major hospital was in Mumbai, an 11-hour drive from Nagpur. All she could do was watch as the ambulance sped away with her son. Early the next morning, Dr. Ajay Mehta had just started his shift in the oncology ward at Tata Memorial Hospital. He was alerted that a new patient named Sanju Bhagat had been brought in all the way from Nagpur and that he needed to be seen right away. Dr. Mehta hurried over to Sanju's room. If someone was rushed in an ambulance from so far away, it had to be a serious emergency. As soon as Dr. Mehta examined Sanju's giant swollen belly, he instructed the nurse to prepare the operating room for surgery. Dr. Mehta was a specialist in tumor removal, and he was certain that Sanju had a massive tumor in his stomach, possibly the biggest one he'd ever seen. The tumor was likely pressing against Sanju's diaphragm, which was why he couldn't breathe. And given how big it was, and Sanju's weakened condition, the tumor had to be removed immediately.
Yes.
While another nurse prepped Sanju for the operation, Dr. Mehta gathered his surgical team and headed to the operating room. As they sterilized their hands and put on clean scrubs, Dr. Mehta warned them that the tumor's sheer size would make this a very challenging operation. There was a risk of damaging the soft tissue in Sanju's stomach, his nerve endings, or blood vessels. In the worst case, the surgery could cause severe internal bleeding or even death.
Yikes.
A few minutes later, Sanju was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. Once he was under anesthesia, Dr. Mehta called for a scalpel. He placed one hand on Sanju's stomach for leverage, then he cut into Sanju's belly. After the blade broke through Sanju's skin and opened up his chest area, Dr. Mehta expected to see blood and a bright red mass of cancerous cells. Instead,
What did he see?
gallons of thick, yellowish fluid gushed from Sanju's stomach,
may
spilling
pus?
onto the floor.
What?
The entire surgical team gasped. Dr. Mehta jumped out of the way, trying to avoid the surge of bile. It had a foul odor that made everyone in the room start to gag. Nurses ran toward him with towels, trying to sop up the putrid-smelling liquid. While they cleaned up the mess, Dr. Mehta remained calm and carefully inserted his hand into Sanju's stomach to locate the tumor. Soft, but with a brittle core. He realized sliding between his fingers. Then he grazed. Mehta remained calm and carefully inserted his hand into Sanju's stomach to locate the tumor. At first, all he felt was thick jelly-like fluid sliding between his fingers. Then he grazed something unusual. His eyes went wide as he dove a little deeper. His palm wrapped around something soft, but with a brittle core. He realized this was not a tumor. Whatever was in Sanju's stomach had bones, a lot of them.
What? Update
Dr.
the
Mehta's
chat.
jaw dropped
It's been hours
as his
37.
hand explored the object floating in Sanju's stomach. He grabbed onto one of the tiny bones and began to slowly pull it up and out of Sanju's stomach. As he lifted the bizarre object into the air, he could hear more gasps from everyone in the room. Dr. Mehta could hardly believe his eyes. What he was looking at shouldn't be possible. He had never seen anything like this in his entire medical career.
So ano nakita
He
niya?
placed it on a medical tray for analysis and turned back to Sanju. Thankfully, he had survived the operation. But Dr. Mehta couldn't help but speculate how something so strange could have gotten inside of Sanju.
Kumsim.
A few hours later, Sanju awoke in a hospital bed. His stomach was sore, but when he moved his hand to grasp his belly, he looked down in shock. The giant lump was gone.
Okay.
He ran his hand over his flat stomach. He hadn't seen it like this in almost 20 years. He took a deep breath and smiled as he felt his chest expand. He couldn't believe he could breathe again without any pain. Just then, Dr. Mehta appeared in the doorway to Sanju's room with a very serious look on his face. He confirmed that the surgery was a success, but as Dr. Mehta explained what they had found inside of his body, the smile slowly faded from Sanju's face.
Ano kaya yun? Ano kaya yung nasa ano niya siya?
The object Dr. Mehta had removed from Sanju's stomach was a ball of pink flesh with a tuft of dark brown hair growing along one side. Two fully formed feet protruded from either end. In the middle was the beginning of a jawline. But what Dr. Mehta couldn't forget was the fully formed human hand that was attached to this ball of flesh.
What?
It was what he had grasped in a gruesome handshake when he lowered his hand into Sanju's stomach.
Oh my god.
The hand had fingernails protruding from it, The nails were so overgrown they almost looked like tiny claws. A grayish-yellow tube grew out of the center of the fleshy mass, connecting it to Sanju's stomach.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Dr. Maeda told Sanju that the surgical staff had witnessed one of the rarest medical conditions on Earth. In a way, Sanju had been pregnant.
Actually
Not for
pregnant.
the 16 years that his belly was protruding, but since before he was even born. The hairy, mutated lump he had removed was Sanju's twin.
Oh my god.
Sanju was a victim of an incredibly rare condition called fetus in fetu, which means fetus in fetus. When Sanju and his twin were first conceived, they started out as identical twins, which is when a single fertilized egg splits into 2 embryos.
Yep.
But something went wrong during that division, and the cells that became Sanju's twin latched onto his embryo. As Sanju developed, his body formed around the twin cells, which in turn fed off his bloodstream. This twin did not have a functional brain or heart, so it wasn't alive in the traditional sense. But as Sanju grew, so did his twin.
Damn.
It fed on the contents of Sanju's stomach.
Damn.
Like a parasite,
Sobrang graphic. Sobrang
using
graphic.
the yellowish tube
Oh my god.
as an umbilical cord.
Girl.
If Dr.
Ay,
Maeda
ginamit
hadn't
sa
eventually...
ano?
But as Sanju grew, so did his twin.
Ay, ginamit
It
na.
fed on the contents of Sanju's stomach like a parasite, using the yellowish tube as an umbilical cord.
Yeah. Oh my god.
If Dr. Maeda hadn't eventually removed it from Sanju's stomach, it would have gotten so big that it would have killed Sanju.
Damn. Crazy.
Sanju recovered physically from the surgery in just a few weeks. But when he returned to Nagpur, he was upset to find that his neighbors still made fun of him. Word had spread in the news about what had been inside of his stomach.
Because he was actually
Instead
pregnant.
of calling him pregnant, now he was the man who gave birth to his brother. After his surgery, Sanju refused to allow doctors to follow up with his case. He never wanted a reminder that he had carried a dead twin inside of his belly.
Oh shit. Damn. Ang graphic, ante.
A few miles from the glass spires
Okay,
in midtown Atlanta lies the Wonder Yak.
Next and final story is called One by One.
Damn. I would have flexed my whole twin sa ganun.
In the spring of 1862, a
You're
man in
stillborn
London, England,
twin.
named Richard Turner sat on his son's bed. He held the sick little boy in his
Lakas
arms
ng trip mo, ah.
and spooned some medicine into his mouth. The child swallowed it and then let out a painful cough.
Crazy.
Richard's wife, Elizabeth, who was standing by his side, looked at her husband with alarm. It had been a horrific few months for Richard and his family. 2 of their 4 kids had become ill and died of a deadly disease called diphtheria.
Ah, diphtheria. Yes.
As their son coughed again, both parents knew he had contracted the disease as well.
D6 and D8.
In the 19th century, diphtheria was a plague across England and Europe. It caused dead tissue to build up in the back of the victim's throat. Eventually, this dead tissue would harden into a thick gray membrane, and it would become impossible for the victim to swallow or breathe. Diphtheria spread rapidly and affected children more than adults. Often, entire city blocks full of kids became sick at the same time. It was highly contagious, painful, and almost always fatal. Worst of all, there was no cure. All the doctors could do was administer a variety of tonics and hope they would reduce the symptoms enough for the patient's body to fight off the disease on its own. The Turners had brought in doctors to try and save their children, but nothing the physicians tried had worked. Now, all Richard and Elizabeth could do was watch helplessly as their 3rd child got paler and weaker from the lack of oxygen.
Kahit
The
naman
little
ang
boy
graphic
became
na.
delirious,
Ewan ko din, at
drifted
least,
in and out of
parang mas
consciousness.
okay naman tong pangalawang
Just
kwento.
1 week after he got sick, he died in his parents'
I
arms.
think it's a lot less, graphic.
At the start of the year, they had 4 healthy children. Now, they only had 1 child left, a 3-year-old girl named Anne Amelia. The Turners were completely devastated. But they were also perplexed. The rest of their neighborhood seemed untouched by this disease, while only their family was affected. The morning after their son's death, Richard went to work in a haze of grief. Over the next few weeks, they barely slept at night because they were listening for any sign of Aunt Amelia getting sick too. Then, late one night, while Richard and Elizabeth were laying in bed, they heard a sound from Aunt Amelia's bedroom, a tiny cough and then another.
Oh no.
Richard's heart filled with dread. Diphtheria had come for their last child. By breakfast, Aunt Amelia was visibly weak. She struggled to swallow her biscuit, and even sipping warm milk was painful. Richard and his wife couldn't just sit by and watch their last child die. There had to be someone in the medical field who could help Aunt Amelia. Their neighbor told them about a doctor they'd heard of who was considered one of the best in London. His name was Thomas Orton. If anyone could help their child get better, it was him.
I prefer my eye care podcast na yung kanina, thank you.
The next morning, Richard made his way to the hospital where Dr. Orton practiced. He managed to meet with him and begged the doctor for his help. Initially, Dr. Orton was resistant to the idea. He was extremely busy, and since there was no cure for diphtheria, he was skeptical that he'd actually be able to help them. But Richard would not give up. He pleaded with the doctor to please help what was left of his family. Their daughter's life was at stake. Dr. Orton was moved. He nodded as he shook Richard's hand, and he agreed to help them. The next morning, on April 3rd, 1862, Dr. Orton packed his medical bag and left for the Turner home.
Okay.
The family lived in the Limehouse district, which was one of London's poorest neighborhoods. He wasn't shocked that sickness was prevalent there. The 1800s were a dark time for the entire city. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a crowded, polluted mess. No matter where you went, it was difficult to escape the stink of raw sewage. Factories spewed toxic black smoke which permanently lingered in the air as a thick haze. Dr. Orton's carriage sped through the dense crowds, past beggars holding out hands for money, many of whom were children. Across the River Thames, trash and dead fish lined the banks. In the Limehouse neighborhood, conditions were even worse. Dr. Orton placed a handkerchief over his nose and mouth to minimize the foul smell of animal waste and rotten food that seemed to be everywhere.
Yeah, disgusting again.
When the carriage finally arrived at the Turners' home, Dr. Orton stepped down onto the narrow sidewalk, then he walked to their door, braced himself, and knocked. Richard Turner opened it, looking exhausted and ashen-faced, but he lit up at the sight of this doctor and welcomed him inside. Once Dr. Orton entered the tiny front parlor, he was pleasantly surprised. The home was like an oasis in this hellish neighborhood. It was clean, warm, and well-kept. The Turners brought him into the children's room. A few toys were scattered about on the floor. Colorful drawings hung on bright green wallpaper, and fresh plants were perched on the dresser. Little Aunt Amelia sat slumped on the bed against a pillow, covered in heavy blankets. She barely stirred when they entered. Her head hung to the side and her eyes were glassy. Dr. Orton could hear her struggling to breathe. The doctor opened his leather bag and got to work examining the child. He pulled out a tongue depressor and asked Aunt Amelia to open her mouth as wide as she could. When he looked inside to the back of her throat, he was surprised. He couldn't see any signs of a thick gray membrane normally caused by diphtheria. This was unusual, but it also meant that the disease clearly had not progressed as far as he had feared.
Okay.
With treatment, maybe he had time to suppress her symptoms and give her body time to heal itself. He spoon-fed her some opium tincture to ease her discomfort and showed Mrs. Turner how to rub ointment made from coal tar on her daughter's chest. Then he shared his findings with Richard and his wife. He hoped he had gotten to Aunt Amelia's symptoms in time before the diphtheria overwhelmed her.
Okay. Hopeful.
Dr. Orton could see relief wash over the parents' faces. Now all they could do was wait. Over the next 2 weeks, Aunt Amelia did not improve. Even though Dr. Orton checked in on her and her parents tended to her night and day, she still became even weaker. And just before the end of April, the 3-year-old died.
Oh, namatay din, sad.
The Turners were destroyed. their entire family had been wiped out in less than 2 months. Dr. Orton's heart broke for them. He felt frustrated and angry. He couldn't get little Anamilia's case out of his head.
Deadly.
Something just didn't seem right. The day after Anamilia's death, Dr. Orton sat in his office, poring through his notes. He struggled to make sense of what had happened. Every other doctor the Turners had hired had diagnosed the children with diphtheria, and all signs did point to that being the disease they all had. Except Anamilia's throat had never developed the thick membrane that normally came with diphtheria. Dr. Orton couldn't shake the feeling that something else had killed her and potentially had killed her siblings. It was a crazy thought, but if it was true, that could explain why no one else in their neighborhood had caught the highly contagious disease.
Yep, makes sense.
Perhaps what killed the Turner children wasn't contagious after all.
Yeah, something else.
Dr. Orton was anxious to get more information from the Turners. So, just after Anamilia's passing, the doctor returned to their house. Despite their overwhelming grief, the two parents welcomed Dr. Orton inside, and they sat together at the kitchen table. He asked them if anything had changed recently at home. He was curious whether they had eaten any new foods or maybe met new people in the area, but the parents said no, nothing has changed. Then
I think no, hindi siya genetic.
At that time, families in the Limehouse district retrieved their water from pumps located on the street. People would have to queue up with buckets or tubs and haul whatever they could back home. The doctor inspected the water, and while it was far from clean, he couldn't imagine that it was the cause of their tragedy. And if it was, he didn't understand why other families weren't afflicted as well. Dr. Orton asked the Turners to think of anything else that might have changed in the last several months. Anything. Mr. Turner paused and said the only thing he could think of had happened around Christmas. They had saved enough money to buy the kids some new blankets and toys. They had even redecorated their room. The holiday season had been festive and happy, and their good cheer continued into the new year. But then, in February, everything changed. That was when their oldest child fell sick. It happened so fast, and it seemed to come from nowhere. Since then, their lives had been a nightmare. Dr. Orton listened quietly, frustrated that he couldn't glean any clues from what the Turners were sharing.
At least, hindi tulad nung kanina.
As he got up from the table, and then asked if he might take one more look inside the children's room. Richard and his wife nodded. As he walked through the empty room, everything looked the same. The toys were still on the floor, the bed had the same blankets neatly pulled back. Then the doctor's eyes flickered past the pictures on one side of the wall, and that's when he saw something that he had not noticed before.
Ano kaya yun?
A few hours later, Dr. Orton was sitting at a table in a dimly lit pub just around the corner from his office. Across the table from him was Dr. Henry Letheby, who was a professor of chemistry and taught at the most prestigious hospital in the country, the London Hospital. As they sipped whiskey, Dr. Orton told him about the diphtheria diagnosis of the Turner children. He described how none of the treatments had improved Anamilia's symptoms. Then he described how her throat had never been scarred by the leathery membrane that was so common in diphtheria. Dr. Letheby agreed that a number of things seemed suspicious, but if it wasn't diphtheria, he had no idea what else could have happened. That's when Dr. Orton shared what he had seen in the children's bedroom and why he thought it could explain the tragedy that had fallen on the Turners.
So ano kaya yun?
Dr. Letheby thought it was a long shot, but he was intrigued by Orton's theory, and he agreed to help him test it.
What could it be?
Anamilia had not been buried yet, so the next day, Dr. Orton ordered a tissue sample to be taken from her body. Then he sent that sample to Dr. Letheby for analysis. In the meantime, he ran some tests of his own on the unusual thing that he had discovered in the children's bedroom. A few days later, Dr. Letheby and Dr. Orton compared notes. They now understood the cause for the rapid and tragic deaths of the 4 Turner children, and it was not diphtheria.
Ayun, di nga.
It all started just before Christmas. Richard and his wife wanted to make the children's room as festive as possible to celebrate the holiday season. So, on Saturday, they decided to shop for new wallpaper and selected a pattern that the whole family loved. It was intricate and beautiful, and best of all, it was a stunningly bright green. The color was actually called Shayla's green, named after the designer. The shopkeeper told them it was a top seller at their store. When Richard put the paper up on the walls, the room was transformed. The 4 children were overjoyed. In fact, they were so mesmerized by the vivid green wallpaper, they tore off little pieces to play with. Sometimes they would lick it like candy.
What?
But what neither the children nor the parents realized was that there was actually a special ingredient in the dye. This ingredient helped to create that very bright green that they all loved so much, and this special ingredient made its way into the children's bodies and traveled through their bloodstreams. It saturated their lungs and caused fluid and mucus to build until one by one, it killed each child.
Bakit nyo kasi didilaan yung papel?
That special ingredient was a deadly poison called arsenic.
Oh my god, arsenic. Bakit kasi didilaan yung papel? Parang gago.
When Dr. Orton had returned to the children's room days before, he noticed that pieces of the wallpaper were missing. After questioning the Turners about the reason, and them saying their kids were ripping them off and licking them, and then after running tests on Anna Amelia's stomach and then the wallpaper itself, the mystery was solved. At that time, arsenic was used in all kinds of household products, from women's makeup to children's toys to dye for all sorts of fabric, and it was in low enough doses that at the time it was considered safe to touch.
Bakit mo kasi didilaan?
That brand of wallpaper was the exception.
Kaya nga.
Word soon spread across England about what happened to the Turner children. Dr. Orton's discovery sparked a national outrage, and concerned parents protested for the wallpaper to be banned. Dr. Orton campaigned for years until eventually the manufacturing of arsenic-based dyes was stopped. Thanks to Anna Amelia, many children's lives were saved.
Bakit mo kasi didilaan yung papel? Parang gago. Diba?
From Ballin Studios
okay,
and
next
Wondery,
episode.
This is Mr. Ballin's Medical... Hey Prime members, you can binge episode 6 per night.
They say shoot out.
I'm Mr. Ballin. Night paranormal investigation at an abandoned hospital, and after you get inside, tell them
Lollipop
you
yarn,
need to use the
gutom yarn,
bathroom,
hindi ka
but just proceed
pinapakain.
to leave and lock all the doors.
Ba yan? Parang gago kasi, sobrang... Oh my god. Ba't mo didila... First time ko makarinig ng ano... ng dumidila ng papel.
This week's story is called Silent Scream. On a Monday morning in October of 2004, 15-year-old Gina Giese rode the bus to school in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, a suburb about an hour outside of Milwaukee. As the bus hit a pothole, she felt her stomach lurch. She'd had a stomachache all morning and barely touched the toast her mom handed her for breakfast. Normally, Gina would have taken any excuse to miss school on a Monday, but today was different. It was the start of homecoming week at St. Mary Springs High School, and she had been looking forward to it since the end of summer vacation. It was also her first year on the varsity volleyball team, which was a big deal for a sophomore. Gina didn't want to miss practice for the big game against their rival school, which was taking place that Thursday. As the bus pulled into the school parking lot, Gina convinced herself that she'd feel fine once she saw her friends and got to class. But the moment she stood up from her seat, she felt heavy and sluggish. It was like an invisible weight
lessons
trying to
ay nakapodcast. Baka mamaya lahat diba? Diba? Kung ganun lang kadali.
The rest of the day fighting
Sana,
to keep her eyes
no?
open until it was finally time
Sobrang
to go
easy
home.
nun.
Later that night, while watching TV, Gina felt her arms start to tingle. She shook it, but the tingling wouldn't go away. Gina decided that she was probably just fighting off a flu bug, and so she just needed a good night's rest. And so she went to bed, and it didn't take long for her to fall into a deep sleep. But when she woke up the next morning, she didn't feel any better. In fact, as the week went by, Gina still just did not get any better. By Thursday, she was still exhausted and feeling achy. But today was the day of her big volleyball game, and Gina was not going to miss it. She dragged herself out of bed, but when she reached for her robe, her arm felt like it was made of lead. But she shook it off and took a deep breath, and then headed to the bathroom. A few hours later, Gina took her spot on the volleyball court. She felt a bit queasy, but she chalked it up to pregame nerves.
D4.
The stands were full of supporters chanting and eager to cheer.
Natin ang panggagaslight na, hindi okay lang talaga ako. Sinabi na niya eh.
The ball over the net. One of Gina's teammates got underneath it, lobbing the ball towards Gina and setting her up for an easy play. All she had to do was spike it over the net. But as the ball got closer to her, her vision suddenly doubled. She was seeing two white volleyballs sailing toward her face. Gina blinked, unsure of which one to hit. She leaped up, swatting at the air, and her palm did make contact with the hard vinyl ball, and immediately a jolt of pain shot through her arm. But she didn't care because she had done her job and returned the ball. The other team dove for it and missed. As the ball fell to the floor, the stands erupted. Gina had scored.
Let's go!
She smiled and blinked a few times. A moment later, her double vision had cleared, and she breathed a sigh of relief. She was on a roll for the rest of the game.
Parang sakit lang ng ulo.
After the game,
oo nga, no. Ikaw nga pala may chronic headache.
She had forgotten all about the double vision from the start of the game. Her arm was a little stiff from hitting so many balls, but she felt better. The next morning, Gina slept through her alarm and woke up late. She tried to get up, but her entire body was so achy and stiff. Her forehead was hot, but her teeth were chattering, and she was thirsty. She desperately needed a glass of water. Gina swung her legs over the side of the bed, then lurched forward to stand up, and nearly fell over sideways. It wasn't that her body felt limp. It was like her joints were so stiff she couldn't move them, so she couldn't walk. She felt like a mechanical doll whose battery had run out. Gina fell back into bed and called her dad, John, for help. John ran upstairs and came over to help his daughter out of bed. Gina threw her arm around his shoulder, and he propped Gina up onto her feet. Then John walked her down the hallway to the bathroom. Even though he tried to look calm, Gina could see the fear in her father's eyes. She tried to thank him for helping, but it was like talking with a mouthful of peanut butter. Her brain knew the words, but her tongue just couldn't keep up. That's when her dad yelled out to her mom, Anne, and said to get Gina's pediatrician on the phone right away. Anne got an appointment and helped John get Gina into her jacket, and then they guided her out to
chronic headache.
Gina could barely put one foot in front of the other. But on the way to the doctor, something even more frightening happened to Gina. Her left arm just started jerking uncontrollably.
C7.
So her mom held Gina's other hand, looking totally panicked and afraid. Gina's mind was so foggy she could barely process what was going on.
D9.
Less than an hour later, Gina was at her pediatrician's office. The doctor put her through blood tests, a CT imaging scan, and an MRI. Once those were all done, they sent her to an examination room to wait for the results. Gina shivered as she sat on the thin paper stretched out over the doctor's examination table. Her arm still shook uncontrollably, and her parched mouth was filled with saliva. She had been drinking water, but nothing could quench her thirst. Eventually, there was a knock at the door, and Gina's doctor walked into the room. He had a calm demeanor, but Gina could see in his eyes that something was clearly wrong. He told Gina and her parents that there was clearly something going on to make Gina extremely sick, but he just didn't know what it was yet. Gina's blood work came back fine. The neurologist couldn't find anything on her CT scans either. Gina didn't understand what this all meant, but she was scared. She could feel drool leaking out the side of her mouth, but she couldn't muster enough energy to make it stop. The doctor handed Anne a tissue, and Gina felt her mother's hand gently wipe it away.
Ano kaya ang
The doctor said
problema?
that Gina needed to see a specialist at a larger hospital in Milwaukee, 70 miles away, and she had to get there fast. Minutes later, Gina was loaded into the back of an ambulance. Her parents held her hand and promised they'd follow right behind. During the ride to the hospital, Gina felt dizzy, so she leaned her head back against the stretcher she was strapped to and closed her eyes. She hoped that this next doctor would have an answer and she'd feel better soon. Despite the sound of the blaring siren, Gina could barely keep her eyes open, and she quickly fell asleep.
Sino namatay? Deads. Yun na pala yung ending.
The next thing that Gina remembered was waking up in a stark white hospital room with fluorescent ceiling lights that hurt her eyes. A nurse came in to check Gina's blood pressure. She asked if Gina could stand up. Gina slid off the hospital bed, and for a moment, she stood perfectly still. Then her body started jerking violently. The nurse caught her before she fell to the ground and helped her into a wheelchair. When Gina sat down, her eyesight became blurry again. It was like she was looking at the nurse through a sheet of wax paper. But even still, Gina could make out the nurse's sympathetic expression. The nurse told Gina not to worry. The neurologists would have her test results soon.
Okay.
Dr. Rodney Willoughby was in his office when Gina's test results arrived a few minutes later. He read and reread the results a dozen times. He was the lead doctor on Gina's case, and he needed to be absolutely certain of what he was seeing.
Okay, ano kaya
He'd been a
yung
doctor for
kaso?
over 20 years, but this was his first time encountering a case like this. And now he was about to deliver the most tragic diagnosis
Oh
of his career.
no.
With a heavy heart, he left his office and walked into the
Ano
small
kaya?
room
Ano kaya,
where
chat?
Gina's parents were waiting.
Ano kaya yung
Anne
dahilan?
and John both stood to greet him, looking hopeful. Dr. Willoughby sighed and broke the news. Gina had contracted a fast-moving, fatal disease that killed almost 60,000 people every year. And while there was a vaccine, Gina was now too far gone for it to work. No one in recorded
Tetanus.
history had ever survived once this disease progressed this far. Dr. Willoughby told Gina's parents that over the next 24 to 48 hours, Gina's organs would fail and her heart would stop.
Oh,
At this point,
very
the
heartbreaking.
only thing they could do was keep her comfortable until she died. Judging from Anne and John's blank expressions, Dr. Willoughby could see that his horrific words had not sunk in yet. Then Anne collapsed into her husband, sobbing. John begged Dr. Willoughby for a solution. There had to be something they could do. But Dr. Willoughby just shook his head. There was no beating this disease. He stood with Gina's parents while they grieved, then gave them privacy to sit with their daughter. By this point, Gina was drifting in and out of consciousness. Dr. Willoughby could tell she wasn't coherent enough to understand what was happening.
What's your guess, ano,
It was
Jules?
heartbreaking to know there was nothing he could do to help her. But throughout the afternoon, Dr. Willoughby was finding it harder and harder to accept Gina's fate. He called the CDC before he left the office. He knew the chances were slim, but he wanted to know if there was any new or promising research that could save Gina's life. They said no. But Dr. Willoughby was not satisfied, so he decided to do some digging of his own. Later that night, he pored over a stack of medical studies and published research. For hours, he flipped through page after page of the same grim findings, drinking coffee to keep himself awake. Finally, sometime past midnight, an autopsy report caught his eye. Until that point, most of the medical community assumed that Gina's disease caused organ failure by eating away at the brain. But this report suggested that wasn't actually true. The pathogens left the brain completely intact. Instead, the virus kills by disrupting the brain's ability to regulate necessary body functions, like respiration and heart rate. That's what causes the body to shut down and die, but not by damaging the brain itself.
Okay.
Dr. Willoughby was even more fascinated by what he read next. The autopsy showed that just before each of these victims died, their immune systems actually began to fight back. That meant that the disease was beatable. It just caused organ failure too quickly for the immune system to react.
So just need
Dr.
more
Willoughby
time.
wondered if there was a way to temporarily shut down Gina's brain activity without killing her. If this could be done, her brain would be protected from the deadly viral attack. The pathogens would be prevented from causing her brain to malfunction and destroy her body. This would give her immune system time to produce antibodies and fight off the virus. That's when Dr. Willoughby came up with a radical idea. It was Gina's only hope. Gina's mother, Anne, was filled with dread as she and her husband walked into Dr. Willoughby's office the next morning. She was expecting a discussion on how to prepare for Gina's death. But when they sat down in front of the pediatrician, he told them about the shocking information he'd found the night before. At first, Anne began to feel some hope, but as the doctor went through the details of his plan, she felt like she'd fallen back into a nightmare. After the doctor was done explaining his radical plan, Anne just stared at him in disbelief. The doctor wanted to put Gina into a deep, medically induced coma to take her an inch from death, to the point that her brain was completely silent. She would have no thoughts and no signals to the rest of her body. Gina would be kept alive by machines. She would need to be kept in the coma for at least 10 days, hopefully long enough to fight off what was attacking her body. Dr. Willoughby admitted they would be gambling with Gina's life. No one had ever attempted anything like this before. If it didn't work, Gina would surely die. And even if the doctor's plan worked, and Gina's body managed to fight off the disease, there was no guarantee that she would even wake up. From the medically induced coma, her
From
brain might never be able to regain its proper functions,
50-50.
and she would be left in a vegetative state dependent on machines to keep her alive for the rest of her life. The thought of that sent a shiver down Anne's spine.
Okay, sino pang time
But
skip
if they
no
wanted
coma?
to save her daughter's life, this was their only option. Anne looked to John, and he nodded. And so, with all the courage she could muster, Anne gave Dr. Willoughby the go-ahead.
He was hip-hop's biggest mogul, the man who redefined fame, fortune, and the music industry.
The first male rapper to be honored on the Hollywood Walk.
Wrote all of Diddy. Listen to the...
To induce a medical coma. The coma would help to regulate her routine brainstem functions, such as breathing and circulation. After the procedure was completed, Gina was wheeled back to the ICU. Dr. Willoughby barely left the hospital for the next few days. He would walk by Gina's room and hear the steady sounds of the machines that had taken over her body functions. He would see her parents were praying at her bedside. Dr. Willoughby prayed silently for Gina too. 10 days passed. The waiting was unbearable. Dr. Willoughby spent every moment anxiously hoping this treatment would work, and Gina's parents spent every possible second by their daughter's bedside. Finally, it was time to take her out of the coma and see if her body had been able to fight off this disease. Throughout the day, Dr. Willoughby lessened the amount of drugs that were keeping Gina
So,
asleep.
medyo kinakabahan tuloy ako dahil sa
She'd soon be able to wake up on her own.
gaslight saan?
But
Alin ba?
as the hours ticked by, the monitor tracking her brain activity was still a flat line. This was a bad sign. If the monitor didn't start showing something soon, Gina might never wake up. When Dr. Willoughby came into work early the next morning, he
Na normal sakit na ulo.
her brain activity
Oo nga.
monitor
Girl,
again.
patingin mo na
Screen showed
yan.
a flat line with the tiniest blips of movement on it.
Delikado
That
yan.
meant Gina's brain was working. Dr. Willoughby breathed a sigh of relief. He couldn't believe that his plan might actually work. But Gina still had not actually woken up from the coma. When Anne and John arrived at the hospital later that morning, Dr. Willoughby led them over to Gina's bedside. He positioned Anne right over Gina's face. Then he opened Gina's eyes with a speculum, which is a tool eye doctors typically use to keep patients from blinking. Dr. Willoughby watched Gina's pupils flood with light, going big as saucers. Then they started to move. Gina was awake.
That's good news.
Dr. Willoughby could see her eyes darting from right to left, looking all around the room, and then finally her eyes settled on her mother's face. Gina's pupils went wide with recognition, and Dr. Willoughby knew she had recognized her mom.
Yun.
Anne realized it too. She flashed Dr. Willoughby a grateful smile, her eyes welling with tears, and Dr. Willoughby breathed a huge sigh of relief. He took out his reflex hammer and tapped Gina's knee. But, to his surprise, she didn't flinch. He tried again, but there still was no reaction. Dr. Willoughby's stomach turned. Even if Gina was still groggy, her body should have naturally had a reflex. He tried to keep a neutral expression, but he knew Anne and John could
Something's
tell something
wrong.
was wrong. He didn't know how to
Okay.
tell them that Gina was awake,
So far,
but physically she was paralyzed.
tada.
She was literally
Progress.
locked inside of her body. The condition is actually called being, quote, locked in, and it's a rare disorder of the nervous system. People with locked-in syndrome are paralyzed except for the muscles that control eye movement.
Phone ko.
They're conscious and can think and reason. They can hear and see, but they can't move or speak, and they can't chew, swallow, or breathe on their own. And there was nothing Dr. Willoughby could do to help Gina. Their only hope was to wait and see if anything changed.
Okay. Time for the hands.
That night, as he drove home, Dr. Willoughby prayed to God for forgiveness. He felt like he had sentenced Gina
real gun
to a
one.
fate worse than death. She could spend the next 60 years as a prisoner in her own body, able to think and reason and feel, but never move. He could imagine how terrifying it would be for Gina to be going through this, after almost dying of a deadly disease. When Dr. Willoughby returned to the hospital the next day, nothing had changed. Gina's eyes darted around the room, but her body remained motionless on the hospital bed. And the day after that was exactly the same. On the third morning after Gina had woken up, Dr. Willoughby arrived at the hospital full of dread. He stopped at Gina's room first and grabbed her chart from its holder on the door. Then he walked to Gina's bedside and removed the reflex hammer out of his breast pocket. Holding his breath, he gave her knee a soft tap.
Gumalaw.
Gina flinched.
Gumalaw.
A short time later, Anne and John arrived in Gina's room, and Dr. Willoughby excitedly asked them to watch as he tapped Gina's knee. Again, her muscles contracted, and Gina's parents went wide-eyed. After 2 weeks of surviving on slim threads of hope, they started crying. This time out of
She's a survivor, bro.
3 months later, Gina took a deep breath and opened her eyes. She was back home in her bedroom. Even though she'd left the hospital a week ago, she still worried that she'd wake up in that awful bright white hospital room, hooked up to machines, unable to move. Coming out of the coma had felt like being underwater. She could hear the muffled voices of people she knew and see the blurry outlines of their faces. But it wasn't until Dr. Willoughby pried her eyes open that she finally broke through the surface. It had taken days for the feeling to return to her body. First, she was able to flutter her eyelids. Then she was able to twitch her fingers. Eventually, she could feel her mother holding her hand. But even as the world began to snap into focus, Gina just couldn't move very well on her own, and even though she understood what others were saying to her, she couldn't speak back. Her parents and the nurses at the hospital had to do everything for her, like bathing and feeding her, and she would spend 2 months relearning how to walk and how to say basic words. But Gina was very grateful to be alive, and while her time in the hospital was a total blur, she remembered every detail of how her deadly illness had started.
Ito na. So ano ba? So ano ang dahilan?
1 month before her symptoms had appeared, Gina and her family had gone to Sunday Mass together at St. Patrick's Catholic Church. A few minutes after Mass started, Gina looked up and spotted something small and black flying around the ceiling.
Okay.
It was a little bird who was trying to get
Dapat lang
inside,
sa
but it
high
wasn't
school
moving
ko.
toward
Ako nga
any
pala
of the
sa...
open windows.
Aba, puta na,
Instead,
champion.
moving
Sige,
down
go.
towards the pews, a little lower
Go,
each
ingat,
time.
ingat.
Most of the congregation was totally annoyed and kept swatting at it with their hats when it flew down. Then the bird grazed an usher who managed to knock it out of the air with a collection basket, and it fell to the floor and appeared stunned. Gina was an animal lover, and she felt bad for the little bird, so she got up from her seat and hurried to the back of the church, and she scooped it up. But as Gina carried this little bird in her hands, she got a closer look and realized it wasn't a bird, it was a bat. Outside the church, she opened her hands to let it go, but the bat bit her finger hard. Gina almost screamed, but she knew there were little kids watching her from inside the church, and she didn't want to scare them. So she bit her lip and whipped her hand away from the bat, sending it flying across the church lawn. Gina watched as the bat flew away and then cradled her finger. A small pinprick of blood bubbled up where the bat had broke the skin. Gina washed her hands in the bathroom and then snuck back into the church pew beside her parents, smiling as parishioners looked over and flashed grateful looks at her. Gina would tell her parents that the bird was actually a bat, but it never occurred to Gina or her family that the moment the bat's tiny fangs pierced Gina's skin, a lethal pathogen had latched onto one of the nerves in Gina's fingertip. And over the next month, that pathogen replicated and grew, crawling its way up the arm and rooting in
my god, no, it's gotta be rabies, right? Because it did mention about something about water na tawag nito, hindi siya makainom. So that's hydrophobia, which is part of the signs and symptoms of of rabies. So it's gotta be rabies, right? Substitute Spotify process tabi mo. Naitawag ako. Okay, G. Well, technically it's from Spotify din naman, so okay lang.
Caused her to have flu-like
it's gotta be rabies, right?
Her vision, made her jerk and salivate uncontrollably.
Yeah.
And eventually led her to Dr. Willoughby's care. But at that point, it was too late because Gina now had rabies.
Dang!
Rabies is an acute viral infection that is transmitted to humans by a bite or by the exposure of broken skin to an infected animal's saliva. The most common wild animals that can transmit rabies to people are raccoons, skunks, bats, and foxes. Domestic mammals can also get rabies.
Yeah, I thought so.
Vaccinated, like cats, dogs, and cattle. Rabies can be cured with a vaccine, but it must be given within 24 to 72 hours
upon
after
birth.
exposure. If it's left untreated, rabies is fatal. The virus causes significant and progressive damage to the brain and spinal cord, and by the time it's reached the brain, it's almost always too late to prevent death. Victims die painful deaths.
I should have known earlier.
Abnormal behavior, hallucinations, and insomnia. But thanks to Dr. Willoughby's radical idea, Gina Geese became the first person to survive a case of full-blown rabies without a vaccine. Since then, other doctors have used the technique Dr. Willoughby pioneered to treat rabies patients when they are not eligible for the vaccine. It doesn't work every time, but sometimes the patient does pull through. It's now known as the Milwaukee Protocol.
Milwaukee Protocol.
It took Gina 2 years to restore her language and motor skills.
I should have known.
She finished high school on time with the rest of her class.
I'm a disappointment.
Then after graduation, she enrolled at Lakeland College to study biology because she wants to work with animals. In one of her classes, Gina studied bats, and over time, her fear of them melted away. Now, she absolutely loves them.
I'm a disgrace from the medical field. Hindi ko agad na pinpoint na rabies yun. Although, I should have known kasi
From Ballin Studios
sinabi niya
and
neuro.
This is Mr. Ballin's Medical
Tapos,
Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr.
oh
Ballin.
my god.
A quick reminder, the content
Maybe I would have
in this
figured it
episode
out if
is
I
not
wasn't,
intended to be a
building
substitute
Gunpla.
for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Hey Prime members,
I should have
you can
known,
binge every week
goddammit.
since had
And lives can.
And this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please invite the follow button on an African safari, but before you go, make sure you sneak 27 raw steaks into their backpack. This week's story is called Blood Feast.
Okay, go on.
It was late in the afternoon on November 18th, 1942. A cook named Mickey McKillop opened the lid of a giant metal vat, then asked his volunteer sous chef, 27-year-old George Nosen, to carry it over to an industrial oven. Mickey and George were starting to prepare dinner for almost 500 patients across 5 wards at the Oregon State Hospital, a public mental facility for psychiatric patients. Tonight's menu was scrambled egg yolks and toast, and Mickey, along with his boss, Mary O'Hare, were the only 2 cooks on duty. The hospital had been understaffed for a year now, ever since the United States entered World War II. Many members of the nursing staff had left to volunteer for the war effort. During the day, there was about 1 attendant for every 16 patients.
Damn.
At night, that number swelled to 1 attendant for every 150 patients.
Damn.
Mickey and Mary were so desperate for help in the kitchen that they had started asking trustworthy patients to help them prep for each meal. And one of those trustworthy patients was Mickey's volunteer sous chef, George Nosen. George placed a frozen 16-pound canister of eggs onto the countertop beside the oven. Mickey liked George, and he felt a little sorry for him, too. George's parents had originally brought him to the hospital for help with his epilepsy, which is a disorder of the brain characterized by repeated seizures. At this time, people were just beginning to understand how epilepsy actually worked. George's parents most likely saw it as a mental condition, which is why they brought him to the state hospital. They probably didn't think he was crazy, they just wanted help with getting his seizures under control. But during George's initial evaluation, the staff psychologist would diagnose George with paranoid schizophrenia, and then they had George involuntarily committed for life. Mickey didn't understand how that was possible. He'd never seen George hallucinate or get aggressive like the other patients with schizophrenia, but there was nothing he could do about it. And if he was being honest with himself, he was glad to have someone so mild-mannered and easygoing to help him in the kitchen. Mickey yanked the lid off the canister that George had just set down, revealing hundreds of thawing egg yolks. These days, a lot of the hospital's food supply came from federal surplus deliveries, since the government was rationing food to help the war effort. The egg whites were used in food that was sent overseas, and hospitals stateside got the leftover yolks. It was time to start cooking, so Mickey dumped out the canister into the metal vat. He repeated the process 2 more times, until the stovetop was crowded with thawing eggs. He handed George a cup and asked for water, and then he lit the stovetop so the eggs would warm faster. He let George dump the water into the vat, then the two of them started slicing bread loaves. Once they were done, Mickey turned on the oven and laid all the bread slices across the metal grates to be toasted. Then he turned his attention back to the eggs. They were finally thawed, so Mickey asked George to grab some powdered milk. It was the only thing that made the egg yolks creamy enough to scramble. As Mickey stirred the eggs, he sent George to fetch something else, Postum powder, a caffeine-free coffee substitute they'd been getting from the government over the past year. Mickey even let George mix the drink himself. He'd never let a patient touch an actual dinner item before, so Mickey took a quick sip just to be safe. The Postum tasted like chalk, which meant it was made correctly. Clapped George on the back and told him he'd done a great job.
Nice.
But that momentary taste test distracted Mickey just long enough for the eggs to start burning. Mickey cussed as he turned off the stovetop, wondering how to fix this. He threw in a palmful of salt and then gave the eggs a stir, and then they looked good as new. When dinner was finally done, Mickey and George portioned the eggs and toast into buffet dishes and then loaded them onto a big cart for delivery at each of the 5 dining halls spread across the hospital's wards. By the time they got to Ward 5, hungry patients lined the hallway outside the cafeteria, urging Mickey and George to please hurry up. Finally, a bell rang and the lines began to move. From behind the buffet table, Mickey watched as the patients ladled scrambled eggs onto their plates. He helped serve them each a piece of toast, and then sent the patients to sit at the long metal tables that ran the length of the dining room. And as the patients all dug into their food, Mickey heard someone call out that the eggs were too salty. Mickey winced and felt bad because he knew he very well could have oversalted them.
Yeah.
And while Mickey was worrying about the eggs, another patient in the room took a long swig of Postum and then started to choke. One of the nurses walked over to pat the patient on the back, but instead of swallowing, the patient keeled over and threw up on the nurse's shoes. The nurse shrieked, and Mickey looked over and saw a red streak on the ground. It took him a second to realize that it wasn't vomit, it was blood. The patient then fell backwards onto the floor, and those around him began to scream. The nurse bent over and tried to steady the man, who was now having a seizure on the floor.
Okay.
Mickey ran over to help her, but
Sana pala naglakad ka na lang, malapit lang pala. Girl, nagsakyan ka pa ba?
Across the table. Mickey shouted for everyone to stop eating.
I mean,
but his warning
kasi
came
ganyan
too
din naman
late.
ako.
More patients began throwing up blood. Others collapsed onto the floor, writhing in pain. Mickey didn't know what to do, so he just tried to catch patients as they fell. One nurse ran into the hallway and sounded an alarm. Mickey stooped over a patient who was clawing at his own face, saying he couldn't feel it. His lips were swollen and blue. He tried to help the man return to his seat, but the man collapsed back down to the floor and started saying that his legs were paralyzed. Mickey was totally horrified, and his hands trembled with fear, and he had no idea what could cause this terrible reaction people were having. Dr. William Lidbeck had just finished dinner when his phone rang at his home on the hospital grounds. When he picked it up, all he heard on the other end was screaming and shouting. Then a panic-stricken nurse got on the line and begged him to run up to the hospital. Patients across 4 of the 5 wards were collapsing, they were vomiting blood, and now losing feeling in their faces and limbs. Dr. Lidbeck dropped his fork, ran out his front door,
wala pa naman
and
mga
across the lawn, heading for the side
nakset ko
entrance of
dito.
the main
Aga kasi
building,
gago, 6:46 pa
100 yards
lang.
from his cottage.
Tulog
With
pa mga
every
yun,
step,
be.
the screaming he could hear grew louder. It sounded like every patient inside of the building was in agony. Moments later, the doctor flung the door open and stepped into the hallway, and the scene that greeted him was
Napakaaga pa,
horrible.
girl.
The hallway was full of patients sitting on the floor with their backs up against the wall, coughing blood into their laps. One man had been strapped to a gurney in the hallway, spasming wildly, blood running down the front of his shirt. His entire mouth was swollen and drool collected at the side of his lips. A nurse ran into the hallway and beckoned Dr. Lidbeck to come quickly. He followed her through a doorway into the cafeteria, where he saw dozens of patients writhing on the floor. The nurse that Dr. Lidbeck had followed dashed ahead of him. She knelt down beside one of the patients and started spoon-feeding him baking soda. Dr. Lidbeck caught up to her and asked what was going on.
What baking
She
soda?
admitted that the nursing staff had no idea what had caused this outbreak, But it had started right after the patients had begun their dinner. She didn't know how to reverse it, but she was just hoping that baking soda would help alleviate their stomach pain. The entire staff was running around in complete panic, trying to manage symptoms. Dr. Lidbeck took a deep breath and tried to push down his rising fear. He'd never dealt with sudden illness on such a massive scale, but he knew he couldn't do anything without the proper equipment. He had to get his medicine bag from his office on the second floor. He instructed the nurse to keep working, then ran out of the cafeteria and down the hallway. He turned the corner into the third ward.
Ang bilis ng effect ko nasa dinner yung... Kaya nga di ba? Then again kasi, direct ingestion dahil kinain. So,
having a steely stomach, but this felt unbearable to watch. He rushed through the hallway, stepping over sick patients as he went, and ran up the stairs to the second floor. But as he left the stairwell, he stopped dead in his tracks. The atmosphere in this ward was completely different. The hallway was empty. If it weren't for the screams echoing from downstairs, it would almost feel peaceful. As he walked past open doors, he saw all the patients tucked in their beds. They looked scared, but seemed to be otherwise fine. Dr. Lidbeck was confused. How was this ward so calm when the rest were full of chaos and vomiting patients? A door opened at the end of the hallway, and the ward's head nurse, Allie Wassel, stepped out and walked toward him. Dr. Lidbeck thought she looked really pale. The nurse seemed very relieved to see Lidbeck, and she would tell him that she thought there had to be something wrong with the eggs from dinner. She said she had taken one bite and they had tasted so spoiled that she ordered all her patients not to eat them. So her patients were fine, but she had been throwing up ever since. A chill ran through Dr. Lidbeck. He didn't know yet what was causing his patients to vomit blood, but now he knew it very likely had to be related to the eggs. It was the only thing all the patients had eaten that night. But it couldn't just be a case of spoiled food.
Exactly.
An egg would have to be so rotten to cause this that it never would have been served in the first place. It would have been obviously bad.
Okay.
Then a realization.
My initial impression, my initial impression, Jules, ay hindi asin yung nailagay nung cook. Maybe it was something else. I'm thinking.
If the eggs themselves were fine, it meant that something else had been put in the eggs that night. He was glad that Nurse Wassel had not eaten more of them. Dr. Lidbeck told the head nurse that if she started feeling worse, to please come find him right away, and then the doctor ran back downstairs to tend to the sick patients. As Dr. Lidbeck went down a hallway, he passed by the hospital morgue. A nurse was wheeling a covered stretcher inside. One of the patients had died.
That's my,
Dr. Lidbeck's blood ran cold, but he didn't have time to stop and mourn. There were hundreds of other patients still waiting for treatment,
progress.
So he didn't have
arms and head na lang. Baka maantay sa kwento.
I'm Sarah Trelevin, and for over a year, I've been working on one of the most complex stories I've ever covered.
There was some
where an emergency state board control meeting would soon commence. From the moment the United States had entered the war, Sprague feared a morning like this. He was worried that the outbreak at the hospital was caused by sabotage, that the country's enemies had deliberately tampered with these eggs. He knew that the Oregon State Hospital received food rations from the government. Frozen eggs had been part of a shipment to the hospital 6 months ago. But those eggs had been separated from a much larger batch. It was entirely possible that someone had poisoned that larger supply, which was then sent around to various institutions throughout the country. Sprague worried that if someone had tampered with the egg supply, anywhere that had received eggs from that batch would suffer a similar attack. Sprague shuddered at the thought of a spy for the Axis powers poisoning innocent Americans. The Food and Drug Administration had already ordered all institutions that received these eggs to immediately stop using them. Sprague's driver stopped the car outside the front steps of the Capitol building. Once Sprague got out, he was greeted by an aide who walked with him up the stairs. The aide had just received word from the hospital. As of 10:30 that morning, 47 patients had died, and their bodies were still lining the hospital hallways, and another 350 patients were violently ill. As governor, Sprague needed to make sure that investigators had the resources necessary to investigate the egg tampering and find out who was behind it. He told the aide that he'd be a few minutes late to the meeting, then headed for his office to call the chief of police in Salem, Oregon, where the state hospital was located. Later that afternoon, the superintendent of the hospital, Dr. John Evans, stood in front of a cage of rats in a laboratory. He was holding a plate full of scrambled eggs. Earlier that morning, a coroner had requested permission to perform autopsies on the patients who had died. Dr. Evans allowed him to take 6 of the dead, hoping the autopsy results could tell him what had happened. A few hours after the coroner had taken the bodies, Dr. Evans received a toxicology report that confirmed his worst fear. The patients had been poisoned. However, nobody knew yet what they were poisoned with or how. The coroner was still running tests. But that was why Dr. Evans was now holding a plate full of the contaminated scrambled eggs that had been served the night before. He was running his own experiment. On a neighboring table, there was another cage of rats and another plate of eggs. But these eggs came straight from one of the egg yolk canisters still in the freezer. A lab technician had thawed them out that morning. They reasoned that if only the first cage of rats died, that meant the poison had been added into the eggs at the hospital. But if both cages of rats died, it meant the eggs themselves had been poisoned before they were shipped to the hospital, and tens of thousands of people could be in danger. Dr. Evans placed each plate of eggs into their respective cages and then waited for the rats to eat. A moment later, the rats in the first cage began to shake violently and foam at the mouth. They squealed in pain, and within minutes, all of them were dead. Dr. Evans looked over at the other cage and saw those rats were just fine. The experiment had worked. It confirmed this wasn't a case of mass contamination or widespread enemy conspiracy. The eggs were clearly just fine when they arrived at the hospital before something or someone poisoned them. But it also meant there could be a mass murderer inside the hospital who was the one who added the poison. Enraged and disgusted, Dr. Evans called the police. 3 days later, on November 22nd, nurse Ali Wassel, who had ordered her patients not to eat the eggs, sat in Dr. Lidbeck's office speaking to a barrel-chested detective. The investigators had been interviewing every patient and member of staff for the past 2 days, trying to determine who poisoned the eggs. Further testing had revealed that the poison was sodium fluoride, better known as cockroach poison. Yung salt, had found some in a basement storeroom, but what they didn't know was how it had gotten into the eggs or who had done it. Ali wanted to help, but she told the detective that she hadn't seen anything suspicious. Until that horrible dinner, she'd been on duty, taking care of patients. She watched the detective as he scribbled something down, and she started to feel nervous. Ali assured the detective that the other nurses would confirm her story too. The detective wrote a few more things down and then looked up at Ali and told her she was free to go. Ali breathed a sigh of relief and stood up to leave. As she reached the door, the detective told an officer standing outside to bring in the next person to be interviewed, assistant cook Mickey McKillop. Ali passed Mickey as she was walking down the hallway. He was waiting in a chair outside the office, bouncing his leg up and down. Ali couldn't help but think that he looked anxious, or like a man who was hiding something. By late that same evening, Mickey McKillop had been in Dr. Lidbeck's office for hours. The detective had asked him the same few questions over and over, pressing him about the way the kitchens were run. Mickey thought he'd kept his story straight, but he'd told it so many times now that it was hard to be sure, and he knew he was likely starting to confuse the details. All Mickey wanted to do was sleep. He had a migraine that was making it hard to focus, but every time he closed his eyes, the detective would shake him awake. And so Mickey was feeling like he would do just about anything to make this interview end. It was obvious the police were suspicious of him, and Mickey knew they would not give up until he, Mickey, told the police what they needed to know. So Mickey decided it was time to come clean. Mickey sat up in the stiff wooden chair, and while avoiding eye contact with the detective, Mickey would admit that he did know more than he had told them. Mickey said that he could tell them exactly who had poisoned the eggs. In In fact, he had watched it happen, and worst of all, he had not done a thing to stop it.
Yung cook.
An hour later, Mickey and his boss, Mary O'Hare, were being led from the Oregon State Hospital in handcuffs. A police officer read the charges. Mickey was charged with manslaughter, Mary was charged with accessory after the fact. Then the officer loaded them into a police van. Mickey took one last look at the hospital and caught a glimpse of a few patients staring out the windows, terrified looks on their faces. One of the faces he recognized was George Nosen, the psychiatric patient who volunteered in the kitchen. Mickey shook his head. He knew that what he had just told the detectives would change George's life forever.
Sinisi niya si George. Probably.
When Mickey the cook finally told the truth to detectives, he began by telling them about the terrible evening the sickness broke out. While the nursing staff was running around treating all these patients who were vomiting up blood, Mickey saw George Nosen cowering in the hallway, and suddenly Mickey had a terrible thought. He grabbed George and asked him to retrace his steps from that afternoon. Mickey and George mimed preparing the eggs, getting the frozen yolks, lighting the stove, getting some water to help warm them. Then Mickey followed George down the kitchen steps in search of the powdered milk that made the eggs creamy. At the bottom of the steps, there were 2 storeroom doors. Instinctively, Mickey leaned toward the storeroom on the left, which held dry goods, but George led him to the storeroom on the right, which held fruits and vegetables. Mickey felt an icy chill run through him. He watched George turn the key and open the right door. George pointed to a large, unmarked tin canister sitting on the ground inside. It was open and filled with white powder. A scoop was sticking out of the powder like it had just been used. Mickey's stomach dropped, but he tried to look unbothered. He thanked George and sent him to his room. Then he ran back upstairs and grabbed his boss, Mary, and showed her the canister George had just pointed out. Mary went white as a sheet. It was against the rules for Mickey to have given keys to a patient. Mary told Mickey that she did understand why he'd done it. They were so understaffed, he'd been desperate for help. But if anyone found out, they were both done for, and so they agreed to keep it a secret. Mary had kept her promise and said nothing, but Mickey eventually broke and told the story to the detective in Dr. Lidbeck's office. Once the detective got Mickey's confession, they knew who had poisoned the eggs at the Oregon State Hospital and how they had done it. That fateful night, George had taken the keys to the storeroom and headed down to the basement. But he went into the wrong storeroom. He went into the right door, and he brought back a heaping scoop of white powder that he believed was powdered milk, but it wasn't. He then poured that white powder into a vat of scrambled eggs, and in doing so, George had accidentally poisoned his fellow patients with sodium fluoride, aka cockroach poison. To this day, nobody knows why the poison was kept in that storeroom with the fruits and vegetables.
Bakit kasi?
In adults, a lethal dosage of sodium fluoride is just 5 to 10 grams, which is a bit more than what you'd find in a sugar packet. Well, George had accidentally spiked the eggs with 5 pounds. 5 pounds?
Oh, bro.
In the end, the charges against Mickey the cook and his boss Mary were dismissed. The hospital was held liable since the real culprit was gross understaffing. The only person who suffered any real consequences for the mistake was George, who was unable to leave Oregon State Hospital for another 41 years.
Damn.
George was never the same after that night. He couldn't forgive himself for what he'd done, even if it was just a tragic mistake. The patients who remembered the outbreak bullied him relentlessly for decades. And after a while, George started fighting back. He got into physical brawls on multiple occasions. And then, in 1983, he got into a big altercation with an older inmate, and during it, George was severely injured and died as a result.
Damn. O nga naman kasi, bakit magkasama yung
From Ballin Studios and
lason tsaka yung
this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me.
O at least magkalapit.
A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional
next
medical
episode.
advice. Hey Prime members, are desperate.
America's heart. But when this
From Ballin, the next time the follow button is really thirsty and asks for a drink, Give them a nice, tall, frothy glass.
Only 5 pounds, imagine. Ang dami nun. Crazy. Sobrang crazy.
In this episode, we're taking you on a journey to 2 wildly different places, the backwoods of Texas and the heart of New York City. The people in these medical mysteries get sick under very different, unique circumstances, but at the end of the day, they all end up in hospital beds feeling scared, helpless, and confused. Their stories remind us of this chilling truth. No matter where you live, anything can happen. The first story is about a woman from rural Texas who goes to the hospital after feeling some pressure in her chest. But after doctors take a closer look, they see something very strange, and so she ends up undergoing one of the riskiest surgeries ever invented. The second story is called The Experiment. It's about a woman living in Brooklyn, New York, and she starts having mysterious reactions to something in her environment, and she has to figure out what's causing it before it kills her.
Okay, interesting yung second story.
Now, here's our first story called The Shadow.
The Shadow.
In a rural area of southwest Texas in 2016, a 49-year-old woman was out walking her dog. We don't know her name, so we'll call her Rhonda, and we don't know her dog's name, so the dog will be Max. Hiking with Max was Rhonda's way of unwinding and letting go of the day. As she walked, she took a moment to breathe in the fresh scent of pine trees and listen to the dried leaves crunch underneath her shoes. There was nobody else around, so Rhonda let Max off his leash. He ran ahead and played in the bushes, happy to be free after a day spent cooped up inside. But after a little while, a sharp yelp from Max cut through the quieting air. Rhonda sprinted down the path to where she last saw him and began shouting out his name. There were plenty of dangerous animals hiding in the tall brush. Snakes, kissing bugs, porcupines, even feral hogs were known to be spotted in this area. Max could have run into any one of them. Rhonda yelled again and again for Max, but she didn't hear anything. Then she heard whining, and Max came running toward her with his tail between his legs. Rhonda immediately clipped on his leash, relieved that he didn't have any visible injury. Rhonda decided to end the walk right there and head home. And then once she got there, she could clean Max up and make herself some dinner. The next few days were uneventful.
God damn, why nobody paints Warhammer? Hi, Rue 63030. Yeah, sorry. Warhammer's out of my budget, even if I wanted to get some for myself.
Figured she might have a mild
Kind of out of my budget.
Throat, but as the days went by, she
I
kept
get that
feeling
as
worse
well.
and worse.
I get why,
She couldn't
rather.
catch her breath, and her chest hurt, and no matter what she did, Rhonda just could not get comfortable, especially when she laid down. Rhonda had high blood pressure, which had caused symptoms like this in the past, but she had been faithfully taking her blood pressure medication, so she didn't understand why she was now feeling this bad. She decided not to take any chances and went to the emergency room of a nearby hospital. As Rhonda sat in the waiting room, all she could think about was the pain in her chest. Whatever this was, it didn't feel like a simple blood pressure issue. A nurse asked Rhonda some basic background questions, like whether she drank alcohol or used tobacco. She admitted to having the occasional drink, but she said she never smoked. She said she didn't do any drugs either. Then, Rhonda was given an electrocardiogram, which is a simple test that records the electrical activity of the heart and indicates any problems with the heartbeat. After the test was done, a doctor came in and read through the results. He said everything looked perfectly fine, but Rhonda told him she was scared. She was certain there was something going on. But he just shook his head and told her she should stay calm. She was probably just having some sort of panic attack. But despite her protests, Rhonda was just given a prescription for anxiety medication and then sent home. But as the week progressed, her pain only got worse. Rhonda couldn't take 2 steps without feeling nauseous. She felt like something heavy was sitting on her chest, trying to squeeze out her breath. Even her dog Max seemed to sense her pain, whining every time she sat up in bed, trying to catch her breath. Rhonda decided to go back to the ER, but this time she went to a different hospital. She didn't want to be sick, but she also didn't want a potentially dangerous condition to go untreated. And the doctors at this hospital were much more willing to listen to Rhonda. In addition to the same test she got at the other ER, This ER also ordered a CAT scan of Rhonda's chest, which is a procedure that uses a series of X-rays to create detailed images inside the body. This time, when the doctor came to Rhonda's bedside to go over her test results, Rhonda could instantly tell something was wrong. The doctor told Rhonda that there was fluid collecting in her chest. This fluid was putting pressure on her heart and causing her to feel tired and breathless. He didn't know why this fluid was collecting, but they needed to keep a close eye on it. If the pressure built up too much, Rhonda's heart could be permanently damaged. Rhonda was then officially moved from the ER to a room in the hospital itself. She was nervous but also relieved. They might not know exactly what was wrong with her yet, but at least they weren't insisting that it was just an anxiety.
The hip joint is so tight, bro.
By early the next morning, Rhonda's symptoms had not improved, and even with the pain medication, she could barely sleep. Her chest still hurt too much. A nurse came into Rhonda's room to draw blood, but right after the nurse inserted the needle into Rhonda's arm, something strange happened.
I think
Rhonda's feet and hands started turning blue. At the same time, her heart rate slowed and her blood pressure plummeted. The pain in Rhonda's chest grew worse, and she tried not to groan.
The thing is so tight.
Instead, she clenched her hands into fists so tight her nails almost cut through her skin. She thought of poor Max waiting for her at home. All she wanted was to cuddle with him and feel his wet nose on her face.
File this a bit more.
As doctors rushed in, Rhonda could tell that things were just getting worse. The doctors measured her heartbeat and then gave her an injection to increase her heart rate and blood pressure. Once Rhonda was stabilized, her cardiologist arrived at her bedside. He could see that the excess fluid around Rhonda's heart was exerting pressure. It was getting so intense that it could stop her heart from beating. There was no time for the doctor to make a precise diagnosis. Rhonda needed surgery right now. That fluid had to be drained or she was going to die. They could figure out what was actually wrong with her afterwards. Rhonda was rushed into surgery, and doctors removed almost 2 cups of fluid from the sac surrounding Rhonda's heart. They also put in a chest tube that would help keep the fluid from building back up. Her cardiologist hoped that the procedure would be enough to stabilize her. Right away, Rhonda started to feel better. Her vital signs improved, and she was able to eat a little bit and even check in with her dog sitter. After almost 2 weeks of feeling totally sick, and now 48 hours in the hospital, Rhonda told herself that this terrible ordeal might finally be over. Over the next couple of days, she improved enough for her doctors to remove the chest tube that was draining the excess fluid from her heart. But just after getting the chest tube removed, Rhonda again started feeling intense pressure in her chest. More tests were done, and they revealed that fluid was reaccumulating around her heart at an alarming rate. Rhonda's blood pressure suddenly dropped, and her body went into shock. Her surgical team sprang back into action. Once again, she was wheeled into surgery to drain the fluid from around her heart. This time, almost 4 cups were removed, twice as much as the first time. Rhonda's cardiologist and his team placed 3 chest tubes around Rhonda's heart to keep the waves of pressure from killing her. After surgery, Rhonda was returned to the ICU, exhausted and barely conscious. But even all those tubes couldn't stop the fluid from building back up. Instead of getting better, Rhonda remained in critical condition. They were running out of time to save her. Her doctors watched over her with a sense of dread, wondering how they could possibly stabilize her if she crashed again.
Okay, keep this.
6 terrifying days later, doctors drained her heart for the 3rd time. This time, though, her cardiologist noticed something strange in the bloody liquid they drained out of her chest. He examined it and realized that the liquid was full of blood clots. Rhonda must be bleeding internally. If one of those clots made its way into her heart, it could block an important artery. This would cause cardiac arrest and kill Rhonda in seconds. Her cardiologist ordered more scans and then carefully studied each one.
Oh, it's for the guns.
That's when he noticed something truly puzzling.
Okay.
Rhonda's aorta, which is the large artery connected to the heart, showed a small, thin shadow. The cardiologist was baffled by it. He knew it had to be connected to the bleeding, but he couldn't tell what it was. He had to find out. To do this, he needed to see Rhonda's heart completely still and without any blood to obscure the view. While it sounded impossible, there was a way to do this. He needed to perform an incredibly dangerous surgery, the kind of surgery that he would only do when there was no other choice. He dreaded reaching this decision, but it was the only way to save her life. Rhonda would have to be put into a state called total circulatory arrest.
Para mawala yung
The surgical
circulation.
team would do
Okay.
this by first drastically lowering her body temperature. Then they would have to stop her heart from pumping. Rhonda would be in suspended animation, with no pulse, no blood pressure, and no signs of brain activity. She would basically be no different from someone who was actually dead.
Yep.
Putting Rhonda into the state would allow her doctors to see what was wrong with her heart, but it only gave surgeons an extremely short window of time to work, about 40 minutes. If it went on any longer, they might not be able to bring Rhonda back. As the surgical suite was prepped for the procedure, the cardiologist and his team went through every minute detail of the operation. Then the surgeon took a deep breath and began the process of putting Rhonda into deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. A cooled saline solution was slowly injected into Rhonda's blood. This lowered her body temperature to somewhere between 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit and caused her blood to stop flowing. A machine took over her breathing. Once all her body functions had stopped, the cardiologist called for a scalpel and made his first incision. The entire surgical team watched as he cut through the sac surrounding Rhonda's heart, carefully pushing aside tiny blood vessels until he was able to make an incision in the aorta. Wearing specialized magnifying glasses, he carefully examined Rhonda's heart. Within moments, he was stunned to see an object deeply embedded inside of her aorta. He carefully removed it with micro forceps and dropped it in a specimen jar. Then he cut out the damaged part of the aorta, repaired it with the synthetic graft, and closed Rhonda back up. Then the team slowly and carefully raised Rhonda's body temperature. Her heart was restarted with a defibrillator. In minutes, blood was pumping through her veins again, and color started to return to her face. As Rhonda was wheeled back to the ICU to recover, the object that had been pulled out of her aorta was already being closely examined by pathology.
So ano kaya yung object na yun?
By the next day, Rhonda's medical team knew the very risky surgery had worked. The fluid had stopped accumulating around Rhonda's heart, and she said she was starting to feel better. Over the next several days, the lab analyzed this object that had been pulled out of her that had basically pierced a hole through her aorta. Rhonda was in her hospital room, chatting with some family, when her cardiologist entered, holding something in a small glass jar. He told her that the pathology department had a little present for her. They knew what had caused her near-death crisis. The object from her aorta that had nearly killed her was an inch-long, black and extremely sharp porcupine quill.
What the fuck? Paano nila
Now
ingest
the
yun?
question was, how had it gotten inside of her? It happened more than a month earlier, on the day she went for a walk with her dog Max in the woods. When Max ran into the brush and began whimpering and whining, he had encountered an angry porcupine. Later, when Rhonda got home, she saw several quills sticking out of Max's fur. Rhonda had painstakingly removed them, but while she was doing this, she had accidentally swallowed a porcupine quill and somehow didn't notice. The quill poked a hole in her esophagus and then made its way to her aorta, where it caused her to bleed into the sac around her heart. Since she had no idea that she had swallowed a quill, she never thought it was necessary to tell her doctors about the incident with her dog and the
Kaya
porcupine.
pala yun yung relevance.
3 weeks after she was first admitted to the hospital, Rhonda made a full recovery and went home. She still went on long walks with Max and still let him run free into the brush. She wasn't the kind of person who lived in fear, but her heart always started to beat a little faster whenever Max ran out of sight.
Na-ingest niya somehow.
Somewhere
For some
out there in the
reason.
brush, there might still be a stubborn porcupine with a few missing quills waddling around.
For some reason.
You don't
magic.
believe in ghosts? I get it. Lots of people don't. I didn't either, until I came face to face with them. Ever since that moment, hauntings, spirits, and the unexplained have consumed my entire life. I'm Nadine Bailey. I've been a ghost tour guide for the past 20 years. I've taken people along with me into the shadows, uncovering the macabre tales that linger in the darkness. And inside some of the most haunted houses, hospitals, prisons, and more. Join me every week on my podcast, Haunted Canada, as we journey through terrifying and bone-chilling stories of the unexplained.
Ang crazy pa rin talaga nun na yun yung na ano niya, ingest niya.
Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
And now here is our second story called The Experiment. On a spring evening in 2014, 43-year-old Amy Pearl looked out the kitchen window of her neighbor's brownstone in Brooklyn, New York.
Hello, pwede magtanong? Yeah. Okay, let's see.
For a cookout. Amy was making a vegetable dish.
Ano mas madaling piliin? Wanting to give up kasi sobrang sakit at bigat. Okay, let's pause the thing.
After the onions were ready,
Okay. Anong mas madaling piliin? Wanting to give up kasi sobrang sakit at bigat na, or wanting mo kasi alam mo kahit masakit ng bigat, at least nandyan pa rin siya. Okay. Okay. So, my take for this one is depende siya sa ano ba ang goal mo. Right? So, it will all depend doon sa ano bang gusto mo achieve. So, if you wanted to, or like your objective to begin with would be personal peace. Ganyan. Personal peace, pagod ka na talaga, ayaw mo na, you know, like, shit ain't getting better. I say go for the first one. Yun yung mas madaling piliin. But if your goal is, you know, have that person to be still there and tough it out hanggang dulo, then I would choose the second option. Kaya it's important to know kung ano ba ang gusto mo mangyari to begin with. Kasi doon, well, at least ako ganun ang approach ko kasi. Doon magde-depend kung ano yung magiging decision ko. So, say for example, quote me on this one. Siguro, just to share like a personal example. Yung recent ex ko from like a year ago. Yeah, a year ago. Ganyan din. Diba, mabigat na, nakakapagod na, ayoko na. Nakakasawa na, alam mo yun, na patong-patong na lang, paulit-ulit na lang, diba? Like, parang wala na akong napapala, kumbaga. Tapos, also the idea na, hindi, andyan siya, kaya yun, winnable yun, paglaban niya hanggang dulo. But, shit didn't work out, obviously. So, when I had to make the call, when I need to make the decision, it was a conscious effort or a conscious decision na ayoko na, pagod na talaga ako, you know. I did my fair share in this relationship and I think, you know, we had a good run, you know. Ganoon. So like, wala talaga kung ayaw, hindi talaga nagana, ayaw ng scenario, na tayo magagawa, di natin mapipilit kahit gusto natin. Kasi ganun lang talaga, no? Ganun siya kahit anong try natin if like the scenario or the situation doesn't really call for it, ain't nothing we can do. So ayun lang naman. The only thing I'm chasing now is peace. I'm so disconnected. Then it's the first one. Ano siya? No hesitation. I think it would be easier to choose the first option. At least the first choice. Ikaw, Jules, nandiyan ka pa ba? What do you think, Jules? What do you think? What's your input, Jules? What say you? 17, 820. Okay, you're typing. Sige, go. Kasi baka mayroong significant input si Jules dito. Baka, well, if you're still holding hanggang sa wala na, ano yan? Objectively, like I don't know you personally, so alam mo yun. Mahirap magsabi ng ano ang alin, ganyan kumbaga. But if you're still holding until ubos na, until pudpud na, until wala na talaga, then hindi inner peace hawak mo. Hindi yun yung goal mo. Kasi if it was, pipiliin mo yung mag-let go. Then again, 2 cents, my 2 cents about the thing. I know I would have chosen the first option if yun yung goal ko. I also did say na hanggang sa wala, ang tanong, kailan naabot sa punto na wala na talaga, di ba? Baka tipong ubos ka na, wala na talaga, pero sinasabi mo hanggang wala na, umabot pa sa point na mag-negative ka. If that makes any sense. Di ba? Baka ginagaslight mo na lang yung sarili mo na meron pa, na may maibibigay ka pa kahit wala na talaga. Di ba? That is an option, That is the thing. Okay. The mere thought na may lumot na bumabagabag sa'yo is a sign that it's harming you and it's not good. Yeah, I agree. I agree with Jules here. But still, at the end of the day, it's your call pa din, if alo ang pipiliin mo. But again, it's easier to determine what your next course of action would be if you know what your objective is. If you know what you want to achieve. You feel me? You got me? So there's that. Yun lang naman, just my 2 cents, I guess. Just my 2 cents. You know what would be good right now? Pandesal. So I'm gonna buy some pandesal later. Pag natin ko secret. 23, 24. We're almost done with the build natin kasi chat sobrang onti na lang neto. Cookie butter pa kaya kami? Cookie butter would be nice though. Let's think of you as a player. May lumot cracks na, and if yung iingatan ka pa rin niya hanggang kailan, you're bound to break at one point. That's overuse kumbaga. So, there's that. Do I have to do this twice? Or not? $823. Maybe I do. Or not. Are they two different rifles? Maging independent ka if ever man siya na yung umalis, baka dalawang beses ka pa masaktan. Magiging independent. Ang hirap naman mo. Yeah, ganun talaga. I know, I acknowledge na mahirap siya. Even when I was at that point in my, my life, na ganyan din, it was a difficult choice. But at the end of the day, the choice that I'm gonna pick would be yung para sa sarili ko. Yung ikabubuti ko. Ayoko yung makukulong ako sa ganyang cycle na wala namang parang in a way hindi ko naman siya ikakabuti. So I'd rather take the L now, kunin ko na yung talo ngayon para hindi na ma-delay yung para hindi na mag-stack pa yung problem or yung pain, if you get what I'm trying to say. Kaya ayun, So, don't get me wrong. I know, mahirap siya. Mahirap na choice talaga yan. No? Especially after all these years, after all this time na pinagsamahan nyo and all, it's hard not to like manghinayang. But at the end of the day, you know, would you really stay if it's that toxic already, or like if it's really hard for you already? So, you know, food for thought. Food for thought. I know I wouldn't, so you know, just so we're clear. Never experienced this kind of love, kaya hindi ko alam. But at the end of the day, and you choose peace, kaya may take yan as a lesson to put. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. I super agree. Kahit may kids na, ba, titis pa rin kahit may. I think ibang usapan na yan. I think kami ni Jules, we were under the impression na, you know, hindi pa may asawa and all. We were working with the wrong set of parameters pala. Pero kasi, I still stand by the idea na, you know, if it's not doing anything good, there's no point in staying. No? If you're like, oh shit, I broke. Oh, that's not good. That's not good. I broke the plastic. If you're gonna say na it's for the kids, then pwede naman. But the kids and yourself are like two different instances, kumbaga. Na, oo, para sa mga bata, ganyan, isipin mo, sikasuhin mo. But that on to play stickers before. But that doesn't mean that you have to forsake your own for yourself, basically. No? Paano mo alagaan yung mga anak nyo kung ikaw naman mismo hindi okay, di ba? Imagine mo yun. Fuck, sticker fell. Diba? May, not, I guess, you know, common siya na scenario din sa mga pamilya in the Philippines na hiwalay yung parents, and sure, it's gonna be difficult for the kids, you know, but like if the parents themselves aren't happy, or like puro problema na lang na ganyan, the kids will be growing in an environment that's not conducive for being a better person in general. So if you're really thinking for the kids, you wouldn't stay, you wouldn't, you know, hindi mo aanuhin yan, aalis ka. Ayaw mo makita ng mga anak nyo yung bad side, kumbaga. You wouldn't want them to grow up thinking that, oh, this is that, okay yan, ganito, ganyan, right? Because that's backwards, you know? That's not how it goes. If anything, you're setting them up for failure. You're setting them up to think na mga bagay na ito ay okay, which is hindi pala, diba? Which is you know, wrong. What? Oh, it's for that. It's for this one. Okay, it clicks. 829. Excuse me, sorry. 824, 27, 20. What the hell? Where is 29? 29. Boom. So, ayun. Ganun lang din naman siya. Then again, you know, take my words, take my 2 cents with like a grain of salt, because I don't know what's your full scenario. I don't know you personally, no. If the best I could give you is like a perspective from the outside, in a sense na impartial siya, Ganun. Na objective siya. That's the best thing I can give you. Offer rather. Kaya, ayun. So, yes. Ayoko din naman pangunahan kung ano ba ang Hi Pika J, good morning. We're almost done. Tada! Mighty Strike. I might fiddle with the stands though, with like the action base, since it's not giving. It ain't giving. I feel like I missed out on some stickers, honestly. But I don't know. Did I? It feels like I did. But parang okay naman. 7:32. Ano oras kayo tatawag? Ano oras kayo tatawagin ni Chris? 17, 18. Let's cut straight. Because I'm kinda want pandesal right now. Pandesal, we have jam downstairs. 50 peso pandesal sounds so great. Absolute banger. Do you guys like eating pandesal? Staple for Filipino breakfast. So cheese pandesal o kaya ube pandesal. Yan. Ay, malunggay pandesal. Dali. Sarap yun. Champion ka dun. 8, 23, 20, what? 24. What's this one? So, ayun lang naman. 2 cents lang naman namin yun, secretly fan. I'm going there for now. I just want to hold on. So hope, but not expecting na ma-fix. I want to say no more what ifs. I want to say soon na no more what ifs. Just what's next. Ayan, that's a good way of putting it. Then again kasi, hindi naman minamadali yung mga ganyang bagay. So it takes time. But like the first step in moving on, I guess, in a sense, is actually acknowledging na ito yung objective mo, ito yung gusto mo mangyari, right? So hindi ka makaka-move on or like hindi mo mako-commit yung sarili mo sa decision na yan if hindi mo aaminin sa sarili mo na yun ang gusto mo mangyari. Does that make sense? Because if you don't, you're basically lying to yourself. Yun lang siya. Ganon. Kaya, yo. Teka, natin ba si Bebe? 1 hour ago. That's enough for work. Sorry, siya. Nakita niyo IG ko. Ayan. Nakita niyo IG ko siya. Stay the thing, the podcast a bit.
Outside to join the party, where the host was now cooking a giant rack of lamb on a charcoal grill. Amy mingled with her friends until it was time to eat. Then they all sat down at a long table. The lamb, wild onions, and assorted roasted vegetables made for a delicious meal. Amy even sneaked some meat to her dog, a brown and white pit bull mutt named Cola. Amy couldn't help but think about how lucky she was.
Oh.
She was a successful...
Thank you, Mr. Guides kay Web mo. No problem. Thank you dun sa regards. No problem. Kaya, yun lang din naman ang okay. Kasi, yung pagtatanong sa stranger. Kasi, hindi ko alam anong kwento mo. Ayan. So, wala yung input namin ni dito. Tawag nito. Input namin ni Jules dito. Impartial. Kung ano lang alam namin. Or like, nilulugar namin yung sarili namin sa sapatos mo. In a sense na kung kami yung nandun sa situation na yun, ano gagawin namin? Ganyan. Kaya, ayun. All good, no problem. Maliit na bagay, man. Are we done? 8:29.
Then she was hit by this awful dizzy spell. In a daze, Amy walked back toward her bedroom.
Secretly fine.
She was so dizzy she had to hold on to the wall.
Damn. Damn, okay. Okay. Ayun lang.
She felt like she was going to pass out. Amy stood back up and attempted to walk off her dizziness.
No wonder you called me by Imsh. Considering na My channel name is Imshi.
Her mind began to race and she wondered.
Okay, sige, all good.
Wondered if she had accidentally
Don't be a stranger na lang if ever. Chat mo lang akong ano man, you know where to find me.
A snail hidden on the wild onions, or maybe the onions themselves were just poisonous. She was worried.
You know where to find me. Honestly, Jules, hindi ko rin alam kung sino to. I have no idea who this person is, but apparently he knows me. And I can't think of anyone at the moment who fits the bill, so I honestly wouldn't know.
She dried her face off with a hand towel and realized she no longer felt dizzy. Amy told herself that maybe a night's rest would just fix everything.
Kaya ayun.
And finally fell asleep. The next morning, Amy woke up feeling much better.
You know where and how to find me secretly fine.
However, she wanted to figure out what had happened. She figured the best way to start was to check in on her friends who had gone to the same party the night before. Amy picked up her phone and dialed the neighbor who had hosted the cookout. She didn't want to alarm them by talking about her symptoms, so she just asked them how they felt the party went. The host was very happy with everything and thanked Amy for making the wild onions. Amy got off the phone feeling totally relieved, and so she called some more people who attended the party, and again, everyone just seemed fine and had a great time. Amy was left totally bewildered and without any answers about what happened to her, but she ultimately just chalked up the whole thing to an upset stomach and tried to move on. A week later, on a Saturday night, Amy decided to stay in with her dog, Cola, instead of going out with her friends. She decided to make a cheeseburger and french fries for dinner.
Oh wow, cheeseburger and french fries. Sounds so good, la.
When the burger was done, Amy placed a slice of cheese right on top and watched it melt. Then she put the burger on a bun and added the fries that she had cooked in the oven. Amy
That sounds so good.
From her fridge. She sat down on the couch next to Cola and took her first bite of the burger.
I know, sa ngayon I will just try to fight my battle alone. Kaya pa naman. Pag di na kaya, G lang. You know where to find us.
And then watched a movie.
You know where to find us.
2 hours later, as the credits of the movie began to roll,
Diba?
Amy hugged her
Di
dog
kaya,
as
diba?
it licked her face.
Na ano ba mali sa pag-seek ng help?
She stood up
It's actually,
and nearly fell over.
asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength because you acknowledge na you can't do this alone. Na mortal na tao ka lang din. Basically. And nothing wrong with that.
What had happened to her after her neighborhood party a week earlier. But this felt different and much worse. Amy made her way into the bathroom, and just like last week, she looked in the mirror and her face looked swollen, and now she noticed.
Nasa high school lang po ako sa may Bulacan, lapit sa VOD station siya. Ge. Ge. Copy.
She didn't know what to do. Her only thought was to make her way to the living room and unlock her front door just in case she needed to
emergency.
but passed out before paramedics arrived. Then she staggered into her bedroom as Cola followed along.
Hey.
Amy wondered if there was a virus going around, or if maybe she was allergic to a new pollen, or worse, maybe she was allergic to her dog Cola. Amy didn't want to think about that possibility because she loved her dog. She remembered how helpful sleep had been the last time this happened a week earlier, so she decided not to call 911 just yet.
Hindi mo ito ilagay na pyesa.
Made her way back to her room. Exhausted, she collapsed onto her bed and she went to sleep.
Hindi ko alam paano ko kinakaya yung pain for more than a year na.
Amy woke up the next morning
Well,
much better. The swelling
your guess is as good as ours. But I'm proud of you for still trying to keep it together, even if it's been really difficult, you know? Not everyone ay may kaya yan. You're fine, you're good. You're doing a great job, okay? Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
She clicked that link and read more. It was about a man in Florida who had experienced these same
So, spare stickers, chat. I don't know how or why. Start wrapping up.
connected to what was happening with her. Amy printed out the article because she felt like she was onto something. A few days later, Amy was seated on the examination table as her doctor stood close by. Her hives
I'm really craving
appointment had arrived.
pandesal at the moment. So, magliligpit na tayo.
And her various failed, the doctor took notes. The entire time, Amy was thinking about the article she had printed out. She even brought it with her to the appointment. Amy hesitated to
Dang, what else is wrong with me? Why am I never enough?
sound like one of those people who
Regarding that...
based on what they read
Wait,
online.
happens a bit.
Instead, when she was on her way out of the appointment, she left the article with the receptionist and asked them to please give it to her doctor. The next day, Amy called the doctor and asked whether she had been
Yes?
tested for the condition
Tara na?
mentioned.
Let me just clean up.
The doctor said he had
Wait
read the
lang.
article.
Give me like a minute or two.
It just wasn't possible. Amy had nothing to worry about, and he didn't think.
Okay, chat. Let's, itawag na ako ni Kurt. So, okay, maghahatid na. I'll be cleaning up. Okay, going back, I forgot to reply pala dun sa ano mo. Ano ba? I don't really know how to approach yung ganyan na scenario na thinking because parang sa akin kasi kung umabot sa punto na question ko if enough ba ako or hindi, isip ko lang na I can do better, ganon, alam mo yun. I'm not the type of person kasi to like stay weekend. Ayan. Not week weekend. Kasi nanghihina na pinagkukulangan ng kung ano man. And I always put the conscious effort to, you know, get better. If I don't, that's on me. Ganon. Ano siya? Inisip ko, skill issue. Oh, I took my monitor. Skill issue ka, kailangan ko lang galingan. Parang ganon. And, you know, yung approach ko ng ganon really helped me out a lot din for like the tough times na I was in. So, there's that. So, you know, I guess, in a way, 2 cents na lang din siya na tipong, yun, tipong get good. Alam mo, sorry, like for a lack of a better, better word. Wala, get good lang din talaga siya on me. Skill issue siya. Kailangan ko lang galingan. Ganon. And I do. I put in the conscious effort to be better. Kaya ayun. Anyways, let's take our picture. Let's call it a day.
20 minutes later, Amy returned and looked very pale. She asked if her mother.
Oh no, it's very top heavy. So maybe I can.
For a split second, she couldn't think straight. She jumped up and said she needed to change her clothes. Even as she said it, she realized how absurd it sounded. She frantically ran to her bedroom, but a minute later, she heard something slam.
I will buy pandesal. I mag-photoshoot na.
Susan immediately felt so bad.
From the left naman. Lagi lang from the right eh.
Kneeled down and leaned close to her daughter's face. She could tell that Amy.
Antay na lang muna secret.
Susan found Amy's phone on the ground next to her. She realized that Amy must have thrown it at her door to get her attention.
Discard. Sandali lang, Kurt. Makakapag-antay ka. Give me a minute, Kurt.
Paramedics arrived and immediately took Amy to the hospital. She was conscious when she arrived at the emergency room a few minutes later. She was immediately given a shot of a drug called epinephrine to prevent her from going into anaphylactic shock. Anaphylactic shock is a severe allergic reaction.
Paalis na kami. Okay, chat. Skill siya parang Valorant, unfortunately. Ako yung mag-read na. Tayo mag-read and run. Sino bang gising? Kuya Jomski. Tara, read and run tayo kay Kuya Jomski real quick. I'm so sorry, chat. I have to cut this real short. Kasi ako yung maghahatid ng kapatid. Kuya Jomski. Ano ba? There we go. Next stream on Saturday, I think. We'll see how it goes. Anyways, thank you all for dropping by. Secretly fine, I don't know who you are, but apparently you know me. You got this, I believe in you. Also, Jules, ingat pa uwi. Kahit mamaya pa klase mo.